Imagine waking up one morning and your whole country is on the verge of collapse. People are starving, soldiers are dying at the front, workers are on strike, and at the head of the empire is a czar who believes his power is inviolable. It was precisely in this explosive situation that Russia found itself in 1917. A vast empire ruled for centuries by the Romanov dynasty began to crumble within a few months. But was the Russian Revolution really inevitable? Or could Nicholas II have saved his empire if he had allowed reforms earlier? Write your opinion in the comments. Do you think that the revolution was a necessary liberation, or was it the beginning of a new form of oppression? In this video, we look at how hunger, war, political blindness, and revolutionary ideas came together to trigger one of the most momentous upheavals in world history. If you're interested in history, power struggles, and dramatic turning points, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more exciting historical topics. Chapter 1: An Empire on the Verge of Collapse. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was one of the largest and most contradictory entities in the world. It stretched from the borders of Central Europe to the Pacific, from the icy regions of Siberia to the Caucasus and Central Asia. On the map, this empire seemed enormous, almost unshakable. It had huge raw material deposits, millions of people, a long military tradition, and a ruling family that had been in power for centuries. But behind this facade of greatness and power was a state that was becoming increasingly fragile internally. Russia was an empire that seemed medieval and modern at the same time, rich in opportunities and yet trapped in poverty, backwardness, and political rigidity. It was precisely this tension that gave rise to the pressure that was to be unleashed in 1917 in one of the most momentous revolutions in world history. The basis of the Russian order was Tsarism. The Tsar was not simply considered a head of state, but an almost sacred figure. His power was religiously exaggerated, politically hardly limited, and deeply rooted in society. Nicholas II, the last Tsar from the House of Romanov, did not see his rule as a mandate to share with parliaments, parties, or representatives of the people. He saw himself as the keeper of a divinely given order. At a time when many European states already knew parliaments, constitutions, and the political public, Russia adhered to the principle of autocracy. The Tsar ruled, his ministers served him, and political participation remained severely restricted. This structure could work as long as large parts of the population accepted it or had no strength to challenge it. But with growing education, industrialization, social tensions, and military crises, this old order became increasingly difficult to defend. The weakness of the empire was particularly evident in the countryside. The overwhelming majority of the Russian population consisted of peasants. Although serfdom had already been officially abolished in 1861, the liberation had not solved many problems. Millions of farmers were legally freer than before, but continued to live in poverty, dependence, and insecurity. Land was scarcely distributed, many families had to survive on areas that were too small, and village communities were often marked by debt, traditional ties, and state control. For many farmers, freedom did not mean prosperity, but merely a new form of struggle for survival. They worked hard, suffered from crop failures, high taxes, and a lack of technical modernization. While nobles and large landowners continued to have large estates, the desire for a fairer distribution of land grew among the peasants. This longing for land later became one of the strongest revolutionary forces. At the same time, Russia was changing due to industrialization. Factories, mines, and railway centers were built especially in cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, Baku, and Donbass. The state encouraged this development because it knew that a modern empire without industry, railways, and arms production could not compete with other great powers. But this modernization happened quickly, hard, and unbalanced. Workers poured from the villages to the cities, but often did not find a better world there, but overcrowded residential areas, long working hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. A new social group emerged in the factories that was concentrated, disciplined, and increasingly politically receptive. Unlike scattered farmers, workers were able to strike, discuss, and organize together. The factory thus became not only a place of production, but also a place of political tension. The contrasts in the empire were enormous. While the courtly world around the Tsar lived in palaces, uniforms, religious ceremonies, and aristocratic self-confidence, many people fought daily for bread, housing, and security. This social inequality alone might not have necessarily led to the revolution, because inequality had existed before. The decisive factor was that more and more people began to no longer accept this order as a natural given. Ideas from Europe spread, socialist, liberal, and revolutionary writings were read, secretly discussed, and passed on. Students, intellectuals, labor leaders, and political activists questioned whether Russia should really continue to be ruled by an uncontrolled monarch. The old reverence for the Tsar began to crumble, especially where poverty, state violence, and political disappointment were directly experienced. The national diversity of the empire was also a constant factor of tension. The Russian Empire was not a unified nation-state, but a multi-ethnic empire. Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, Balts, Georgians, Armenians, Jews, Tatars, and many other groups lived under the rule of the Tsar. Many of them experienced the Russian central power not as protection, but as oppression. Language policy, religious tensions, anti-Semitic discrimination, and interventions in local traditions led to resentment. The attempt to bind the empire closer together through Russification often generated the opposite: resistance, mistrust, and the will to assert itself nationally. Tsarism was thus faced not only with a social question, but also with a national question. He had to hold together a huge, diverse empire without giving people real political participation. A decisive turning point was the Revolution of 1905. For the first time, it openly showed how deep the crisis already was. The triggers included the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, economic hardship, and the bloody suppression of a peaceful demonstration in St. Petersburg. For many people, the so-called Bloody Sunday destroyed their faith in the benevolent Tsar. Workers, farmers, soldiers, and members of the middle class raised their voices. There were strikes, uprisings, mutinies, and political demands. Nicholas II finally had to make concessions, including the establishment of a Duma, i.e. a parliament. But these reforms remained half-hearted. The Tsar retained decisive powers, the Duma was controlled and restricted, and real democratic participation did not emerge. This did not solve the crisis, but only postponed it. After 1905, the government tried to stabilize the Reich. There were attempts at reform, especially in agriculture, but they did not reach enough people and came too late to overcome the deep differences. Political repression continued. Revolutionary groups were persecuted, newspapers censored, activists arrested or forced into exile. But repression did not eliminate the causes of resentment. On the contrary, it radicalized many opponents of the system. Those who saw no legal way to enforce change were more willing to support illegal and revolutionary ways. For many, the state did not appear to be a neutral force for order, but an instrument of a privileged minority. Particularly dangerous for Tsarism was its inability to create confidence. Nicholas II often seemed indecisive, but at the same time stubborn. He wanted to preserve autocracy, but understood less and less how much society was changing. There was a growing distance between the farm and the population. Scandals about Rasputin's influence on the Tsar's family further damaged the monarchy's reputation, especially during the First World War. Many people believed that at court, intrigue, incompetence, and religious superstition were more important than the suffering of the people. Whether all the rumors were true was less decisive than their effect. They nourished the impression that the top of the state was deteriorating morally and politically. Then came the First World War and turned a serious crisis into an existential catastrophe. Russia entered the war in 1914, buoyed by patriotic enthusiasm and the hope of maintaining its position as a great power. But the war relentlessly exposed the weaknesses of the empire. The army was huge, but poorly supplied. There was a lack of weapons, ammunition, transport capacities, medical care, and efficient leadership. Millions of soldiers were mobilized, millions of families lost their workforce, and the economy came under enormous pressure. Defeats at the front, high casualties and supply problems in the cities shook confidence in the state and monarchy. The war devoured people, money, food, and hope. In the cities, the situation worsened dramatically. Bread became scarce, prices rose, wages lost value, and long queues in front of shops became a symbol of collapse. Workers, who were already living in harsh conditions, felt the war directly. They produced for the front, but starved themselves. Frontline soldiers wondered why they would die for a system that couldn't feed their families. Farmers wondered why their sons were fighting while the land question remained unresolved. Even parts of the elites increasingly doubted the Tsar's leadership. The crisis thus affected not only the lower classes, but the entire political structure. So, on the eve of the revolution, Russia was not a stable empire that was suddenly shaken out of nowhere. It was a state in which unresolved conflicts had accumulated for decades. The peasants wanted land, the workers wanted better living conditions, many nationalities wanted more rights, liberals wanted political reforms, socialists wanted a new society, and soldiers wanted peace and survival above all. Above all this stood a czar who did not understand the signs of the times or did not want to understand them. The Russian Revolution was therefore not a single moment, but the result of a long chain of wrong decisions, social tensions, political oppression, and military overload. Thus began the year 1917 in an empire that still existed on the outside, but was already exhausted on the inside. The palaces were still standing, the officials were still working, the army was still fighting, and the Tsar was still signing orders. But the loyalty on which this order was based disintegrated. People often obey a system as long as they believe it is either just, strong, or inevitable. In Russia, it is precisely this belief that has disappeared. The empire seemed powerful, but its foundations had become cracked. When hunger, war, and protest finally came together, all it took was a spark to trigger the collapse. This spark was to be ignited in the streets of Petrograd in February 1917. Chapter 2: The Tsar and His System. To understand the Russian Revolution, one must first understand what kind of power prevailed in the Tsarist Empire. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was not simply a monarchy like many other European states. It was an autocracy, a state in which the highest political power was almost entirely concentrated in the person of the Tsar. Nicholas II was not only a king of ceremonial importance, but also the supreme ruler of government, military, administration, and large parts of public life. His authority was not derived from a constitution, an election, or a parliament, but from tradition, religion, and dynastic claims. The Tsar was considered to have been appointed by God, the father of the people, the center of an empire that stretched over immeasurable spaces and countless peoples. It was precisely this idea that made the system so rigid. Anyone who questioned the power of the Tsar was criticizing not only a government, but apparently the entire divine and historical order of Russia. Nicholas II took over the reign in 1894 after the death of his father Alexander III. Even then, Russia was a country full of tensions. There were demands for reform, social hardship, national discontent, and a growing revolutionary movement. But Nicholas was hardly prepared for this task. Privately, he was not a cruel person in the simple sense, but politically weak, suspicious of reforms, and deeply convinced that any restriction of his power was a betrayal of his duty. He did not see himself as a modern statesman who had to mediate between social interests, but as the guardian of an old order. In his eyes, autocracy was not an outdated system, but the foundation of Russia. Precisely for this reason, he could only reluctantly allow reforms and often withdrew them as soon as an opportunity presented itself. The Tsarist system was based on a close connection between the monarchy, the Orthodox Church, the nobility, the bureaucracy, the military, and the police. The Orthodox Church played an important role in this because it religiously supported the rule. The Tsar was portrayed as the protector of the faith, as the earthly guarantor of a higher order. In churches, schools, and public ceremonies, loyalty to the Tsar was conveyed as a moral duty. This combination of religion and politics gave the ruler a special dignity, but it also made any sober criticism difficult. When power is sacredly exaggerated, dissent quickly appears as a sin, rebellion, or betrayal. For many ordinary people, the Tsar remained a distant father figure for a long time, while they blamed officials, landowners, or local rulers for their suffering. But the stronger the crises became, the more the disappointment was directed directly at the top of the empire. The nobility formed another pillar of order. Although he had lost some of his old economic power in the course of the 19th century, especially after the abolition of serfdom, he remained politically and socially influential. Many high-ranking military officers, civil servants, and members of the court came from noble families. They saw the Tsarist Empire not only as a state, but as the basis of their own position. In her eyes, reforms that would have given farmers more land, workers more rights, or real power to parliament threatened the existing order. As a result, conservative elites were often willing to support the Tsar against change. At the same time, however, they were not always satisfied with Nicholas II. Many of them considered him too weak, too impressionable, or politically clumsy. This tension later became dangerous, because an autocratic system needs not only obedience from below, but also trust from above. The administration of the empire was enormous, cumbersome, and often unrealistic. Russia was a huge state in which decisions had to be enforced from the capital to distant provinces, villages, and border regions. Civil servants played a central role in this. They collected taxes, monitored the population, executed laws, and reported to the top. But the bureaucracy was often inefficient, corrupt, and far removed from the reality of people's lives. For many peasants and workers, the state was not the Tsar himself, but the local official, the policeman, the tax collector, or the military recruiter. These representatives of the state were often experienced as cold, arbitrary, and foreign. A system that was based on obedience and control, but allowed little co-determination, thus generated lasting bitterness. The role of the secret police was particularly important. As early as the 19th century, the Tsarist Empire had experienced how dangerous revolutionary groups could become. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by revolutionaries. This event had a profound impact on the political culture of the empire. The government reacted to opposition not only with laws, but also with surveillance, censorship, arrests, banishment, and spies. The Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, infiltrated revolutionary groups, monitored suspects, controlled pamphlets, and tried to dismantle opposition networks. But repression had a double effect. On the one hand, it could weaken organizations and intimidate activists. On the other hand, it drove many opponents of the system underground and intensified their hatred of the state. Those who were not allowed to express peaceful criticism often sought more radical ways. In this way, the state itself became an engine of radicalization. Censorship was another tool of power. Newspapers, books, leaflets, and public speeches were checked. Political debates could not take place freely. Although certain free spaces were created, especially after 1905, they remained uncertain and limited. The government feared that open discussions could undermine the Tsar's authority. In doing so, she overlooked the fact that the ban on criticism did not make the problems disappear. On the contrary, rumors and mistrust became stronger. When people did not believe official information, stories about corruption, betrayal, foreign influences, or courtly intrigues spread all the faster. Later, it was precisely this climate of mistrust that would play an important role, especially during the First World War, when many Russians were convinced that the government was incompetent or even treacherous. A core problem of Tsarism was that it saw reforms only as a danger, not as a possibility of stabilization. After the revolution of 1905, Nicholas II was forced to make concessions. The October Manifesto promised civil liberties and a representation of the people, the Duma. For many people, this initially seemed to be the beginning of a constitutional age. But the Tsar never really accepted this development inwardly. He did not want a real parliamentary monarchy, but only as much reform as was necessary to calm the crisis. The Basic Laws of 1906 continued to confirm its strong position. He could appoint and dismiss ministers, determine foreign policy, lead the military, and dissolve the Duma. Thus, the people's representation remained dependent on the mercy of the ruler. The hope for political renewal was thus disappointed. These half-hearted reforms did not make the system more stable, but more contradictory. Russia now had a parliament, but no real parliamentary government. There were parties, but no full political freedom. There were public debates, but censorship and surveillance continued. Liberal forces became frustrated because they noticed that their demands for the rule of law and the Constitution were repeatedly blocked. Revolutionary groups saw themselves vindicated because they claimed that the system could not be reformed. Conservatives, on the other hand, already feared the limited concessions and urged toughness. The Tsar stood between these forces, but instead of mediating wisely, he held on to his distrust of any power sharing. He wanted to preserve the old order, but no longer had the strength to renew it convincingly. The weakness of the system was also evident in the military. The army was one of the most important pillars of the autocracy. It was supposed to defend the empire externally and put down uprisings internally. Discipline, obedience, and loyalty to the Tsar were central values. But the army also reflected the social contrasts of the country. The officers often came from the higher classes, while the ordinary soldiers were farmers who were drafted from their villages. They brought their worries, their poverty, and their hunger for land with them to the barracks. As long as the army remained loyal, Tsarism was able to survive crises. But when soldiers began to identify with striking workers and starving families, the system became vulnerable. This is exactly what was to happen in 1917. Nicholas II himself exacerbated this vulnerability through his decisions. He was not a charismatic leader who could inspire trust in times of crisis. He often seemed distant, dutiful, but indecisive. His close family, especially his wife Alexandra, strongly influenced his perception. Alexandra, on the other hand, was exposed to many suspicions during the war because of her German origins. In addition, there was the notorious influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian itinerant preacher who gained access to the Tsar's family because of his alleged ability to help the sick Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a dangerous blood disease that was kept secret at court for a long time. Rasputin's closeness to the family generated rumors of corruption, moral decay, and political manipulation. Many of these stories were exaggerated, but their political impact was devastating. They made the monarchy appear ridiculous, mysterious, and weak. The tragedy of the Tsarist system was that it did not recognize its own weakness in time. It relied on tradition, obedience, police, and military, while society changed faster than the rulers wanted to comprehend. Farmers wanted land, workers wanted dignity, national minorities wanted recognition, liberals wanted rights, socialists wanted overthrow, and even parts of the elite wanted a government that was more capable of acting. Nicholas II might not have been able to resolve all conflicts, but his refusal to share real political responsibility deprived the system of any possibility of peaceful adjustment. It remained tough where it needed to be flexible and weak where it needed strength. Thus, Tsarism became a building with magnificent facades and rotten beams. From the outside, you could see uniforms, church domes, palaces, parades, and imperial orders. Internally, however, mistrust, social anger, and political alienation grew. The Tsar's power was enormous, but it was based on the assumption that people would obey because they had always obeyed. When war, hunger, and defeat destroyed this habit, it became apparent how little real bond had remained. The Tsar and his system still stood tall, but they had lost the ability to shape the future. This was precisely where their greatest danger lay. It was not only the enemies of the monarchy that destroyed the Tsarist Empire, but also its own inability to change. Chapter 3: Peasants, Workers, and Soldiers. The Russian Revolution arose not only in the minds of political theoreticians, not only in secret circles of revolutionaries, and not only in the palaces of power. Its deepest strength came from the everyday lives of millions of people who lived in conditions they were less and less willing to bear. Peasants, workers, and soldiers together formed the great social mass of the empire. They were the ones who tilled fields, kept factories running, built railroads, mined coal, produced weapons, and died at the front. Without them, the state could not exist. But it is precisely these people who have the least influence on political decisions. They bore the burdens of the empire, but they hardly determined its direction. This contradiction grew into a dangerous unrest that accumulated over the years and finally turned into revolutionary energy. The peasants were the largest population group in Russia. Their lives were marked by hard work, dependence on weather and harvest, close-knit village communities, and constant uncertainty. Although serfdom had been abolished in 1861, for many peasants this had changed less than they had hoped. They were no longer the personal property of a landlord, but economically they often remained trapped. Many had to make so-called transfer payments in order to use the land that had been allocated to them after the reform. These payments burdened entire village communities for decades. In addition, the allocated areas were often too small, too poorly or too unfavorably distributed to feed a family in the long term. In a country where the population was growing strongly, the lack of land became more and more urgent. For many farmers, life did not mean progress, but an endless struggle for enough bread, enough seeds, and enough land. The hunger for land was therefore one of the most powerful social forces in the Russian Empire. Farmers saw the large estates of the nobility, the church and the state, and wondered why they had to struggle to survive even on small plots. For them, land was not only property, but security, dignity, and a future. Those who had land could feed their families, avoid debts, and maintain a certain independence. Those who had no or too little land were dependent on wage labor, rent, or help from others. This longing for land made many peasants receptive to revolutionary slogans. But their revolutionary stance was often less ideological than practical. Many were not initially interested in Marxism, party programs, or abstract theories. They wanted land, lower taxes, less arbitrariness, and an end to the rule of those who decided on their lives without sharing their suffering. At the same time, the village was not simply a place of passive poverty. There were traditions of self-government, communal decisions, and forms of resistance. Farmers could rebel against landlords, use forests illegally, occupy fields, refuse to pay taxes, or expel local officials. Such actions often seemed spontaneous, but followed a deep idea of justice. Many farmers believed that the land actually belonged to those who worked it. This moral conviction was in contradiction to the property system of the empire. The state defended the property of the landowners, while peasants saw an injustice in this order. This created a tension between legal law and perceived right. In revolutionary times, it was precisely this tension that could explode. While the peasants in the countryside suffered, a new class grew up in the cities, the working class. Russia's industrialization had begun late compared to Great Britain or Germany, but then proceeded very quickly in some areas. Factories, mines, steel mills, and railways sprang up, especially in large centers such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, Baku, the Urals, and the Donbass. The state promoted industry because it wanted to make Russia militarily and economically competitive. But modernization was directed from above and had little regard for the people who had to wear it. Many workers came directly from the villages. They brought farming experience with them, but now lived in a completely different world of machine noise, shift work, confinement, and constant control. The everyday life of the workers was hard. Working hours were long, wages low, apartments overcrowded, and hygienic conditions often miserable. Strict discipline prevailed in many companies. Supervisors could impose penalties, cut wages, or dismiss workers. Accidents at work were frequent. Social security was weak. Anyone who fell ill or lost their job quickly found themselves in need. At the same time, workers in the cities experienced a new form of community. They worked close to each other, lived in working-class neighborhoods, stood together in front of factory gates and shared similar experiences of exploitation and humiliation. This allowed them to organize faster than farmers who lived scattered over huge rural areas. A strike in a large factory could have an immediate political impact, especially if other factories followed. It was precisely in the factories that social and political demands were combined. In the beginning, it was often about wages, working hours, breaks, security, or treatment by superiors. But under the conditions of the Tsarist Empire, even an economic strike quickly became political. When workers demanded better conditions, they encountered not only employers, but also police, military, and state bans. Trade unions were restricted, political gatherings were dangerous, strikes could be violently suppressed. As a result, many workers learned that their plight was not only related to individual factory owners, but to the entire state system. The call for bread and wages increasingly turned into the call for rights, freedom, and political change. The workers were also so important because they were accessible to revolutionary parties. Social Democrats, social revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and Bolsheviks tried to gain influence in the factories. Leaflets were distributed, secret meetings were organized, strikes were supported, and political terms were explained. Not every worker was a convinced revolutionary, but many were open to ideas that took their situation seriously. The Bolsheviks later understood particularly well that clear, simple slogans could have a stronger effect than long programs in a time of crisis. Peace, land, and bread were not abstract promises, but took up precisely those needs that millions of people felt directly. Between peasants and workers stood another group that became decisive for the fate of the revolution: the soldiers. The Russian army consisted largely of conscripted peasants. This meant that the concerns of the village were carried into the barracks and trenches. A soldier was not just a fighter in uniform, but often a farmer's son, husband, father, or brother, whose family fought at home for land, food, and labor. When he was at the front, he knew that his absence on the farm had serious consequences. The war separated him from his village, but it did not extinguish his peasant interests. On the contrary, the experience of violence, hunger, cold, and poor behavior often reinforced the desire to return home and ensure one's survival. The First World War turned the dissatisfaction of the soldiers into a huge political danger. Russia mobilized millions of men, but the army was ill-prepared for a modern industrial war. There was a lack of weapons, ammunition, boots, warm clothing, medical care, and reliable supplies. Many soldiers experienced being sent into costly attacks without being adequately equipped. The officers, often from higher classes, often seemed distant, arrogant, or incompetent to ordinary soldiers. Of course, there were also dutiful and brave officers, but the social gap within the army remained large. The longer the war lasted, the more discipline broke down. Desertions increased, orders were questioned, and the willingness to die for the Tsar dwindled. The soldiers thus became the decisive link between the state and the revolution. As long as they remained loyal, the monarchy could crush protests. But when they began to show solidarity with workers and peasants, the state lost its last reserve of power. It was precisely this development that was decisive in 1917. In Petrograd, soldiers were no longer reliably on the side of the government. Many refused to shoot at demonstrators or defected to them. This was more than a military mutiny. It was a political collapse. An autocratic state may still be able to survive strikes, hunger, and protests as long as its armed power works. But when the men with the guns no longer obey, a crisis becomes a revolution. Peasants, workers, and soldiers were not a unified mass. Their interests overlapped, but they were not identical. Farmers wanted land above all. Workers wanted better living conditions, rights, and influence. Soldiers often wanted peace and return home. But in the crisis, these demands combined to form a common rejection of the existing system. Tsarism had not succeeded in giving the peasants a just order of land, in granting social security and political rights to the workers, or in sparing the soldiers a war that seemed senseless to them. Each of these groups had its own reasons for discontent, but together they formed a force that could shake the empire. So the revolution was not triggered by ideology alone. It grew out of hunger, exhaustion, humiliation, and disappointed hopes. It arose from long working days, empty pantries, unfair distribution of land, cold trenches, and the feeling that the rulers lived far away from the suffering of the people. When the crisis reached its peak, revolutionary parties did not have to invent this anger. They just had to give it a direction. People were already ready not to go on living as before. This was precisely the real danger for the Tsarist Empire. It was not a small group of conspirators alone that brought down Russia, but the deep alienation of those millions on whose work, obedience, and sacrifice the whole empire was built. Chapter 4: The Revolution of 1905. The Revolution of 1905 was the first major crack in the foundation of the Tsarist Empire. It was not yet the final collapse, but it showed with frightening clarity how deep Russia's crisis had already become. Many people later saw it as a kind of dress rehearsal for the year 1917, because almost all the forces that were to break out again 12 years later were already emerging at that time: striking workers, dissatisfied peasants, mutinous soldiers, liberal citizens, revolutionary parties, national minorities, and a czar who vacillated between concessions and violence. The revolution of 1905 did not arise from a single event, but from a long chain of disappointments. It was the result of social hardship, political oppression, military defeats, and a deep loss of confidence in the monarchy. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was an empire full of contradictions. On the one hand, it wanted to be a modern great power, with factories, railways, an army, and imperial influence. On the other hand, his political order remained rigid and authoritarian. Workers lived in harsh conditions, peasants waited for land, intellectuals demanded freedom, and national minorities suffered under Russian dominance. It was in this tense situation that the war against Japan began. The Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905 became a severe humiliation for the Tsarist Empire. The government had believed that a victory against Japan could strengthen patriotism and distract from internal problems. But the opposite happened. Russian troops suffered defeats in East Asia. The fortress of Port Arthur fell, and the Russian fleet was crushingly defeated in the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. For an empire that saw itself as a European great power, this defeat was a shock. It destroyed the myth of military strength and made many people doubt the government's ability. But the deepest trigger of the revolution was not only in the war, but in the everyday life of the people. In the cities, living conditions worsened. Workers suffered from low wages, long working hours, and rising prices. Many lived in cramped apartments, often without adequate supplies, without security, and without a political voice. At the same time, there was a growing awareness in the factories that joint action was possible. Strikes were not only economic protests, but increasingly became political signs. Those who demanded better wages quickly came up against the power of the state. The police and military were often on the side of the entrepreneurs and authorities. This gave rise to the conviction among many workers that their plight had to do not only with individual factory owners, but with the entire system of Tsarism. The decisive moment came in January 1905 in St. Petersburg. A large group of workers wanted to hand over a petition to the Tsar. It was led by the priest Georgy Gapon, who had gained influence in working-class circles. The demonstrators marched peacefully to the Winter Palace. Many carried icons, religious symbols, and pictures of the Tsar. They did not come as armed rebels, but as pleading subjects. In their petition, they demanded better working conditions, shorter working hours, fairer wages, political rights, and a parliament. Many still believed in the Tsar as the good father of the people, who just didn't know how much his subjects suffered. It was precisely this hope that made the following event so shattering. The authorities did not let the demonstration through to the palace. Soldiers opened fire on the crowd. There were deaths and injuries, and although the exact number is still given differently today, the effect was clear. The so-called Bloody Sunday destroyed many people's faith in the benevolent Tsar. What had begun as a petition ended as a massacre. The Tsar himself was not in the Winter Palace, but politically that hardly mattered. For many workers it was clear, the state had responded to peaceful demands with violence. Disappointment turned into anger, loyalty turned into hatred. Bloody Sunday became a symbol of the moral bankruptcy of the autocracy. After this event, unrest spread throughout the empire. Strikes affected numerous cities and industries. Workers shut down factories, railroad workers disrupted traffic, students protested, and political groups tried to organize the movement. The demands became more and more comprehensive. It was no longer just about bread and wages, but about freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, political prisoners, a constitution, and an elected parliament. Liberal forces, especially from the bourgeoisie and parts of the educated classes, also demanded reforms. They did not necessarily want to turn Russia into a socialist society, but they wanted to limit the arbitrariness of autocracy. A modern state, they believed, needed legal certainty, co-determination, and public responsibility. There were also uprisings in the countryside. Farmers attacked manor houses, plundered supplies, occupied land, or refused to pay taxes. Their revolt was often less centrally organized than the workers' movement in the cities, but it was no less dangerous for the Reich, because the farmers formed the majority of the population. If their anger was directed against the landowners and the state authorities, the Tsarist Empire could not react everywhere at the same time. The hunger for land, which had been growing for decades, now came to the fore. Many farmers saw the revolution as an opportunity to correct a system of property that was perceived as unjust. For them, freedom meant above all land and protection from arbitrariness. The situation became particularly threatening when parts of the military also became restless. The most famous mutiny took place on the battleship Potemkin. Sailors of the Black Sea Fleet rose up against their officers after poor provisions, harsh discipline, and general discontent had made the tension unbearable. The mutiny showed that even the armed forces, the main pillar of autocracy, were not completely reliable. Although the army as a whole still remained strong enough to save the state, the shock was great. When soldiers and sailors began to question the order of command, the Tsar's rule was threatened at its core. During this time, new forms of political organization also emerged. The Soviets, i.e. workers' and soldiers' councils, were particularly important. The best known was the St. Petersburg Soviet. It became a center of the strike movement and showed that workers could not only protest, but also form their own political structures. The Soviet was not a classic party and not a parliament in the bourgeois sense. It was a revolutionary organ that arose from the movement itself. Delegates from companies met here, discussed demands, coordinated strikes, and formulated political goals. This was dangerous for the government, because a kind of countervailing power emerged on the streets and in the factories. Nicholas II and his government were now faced with a decision. Pure force was no longer enough to end the crisis quickly. The empire was shaken, the war against Japan was lost, the economy was paralyzed, and the protests united different social groups. Therefore, in October 1905, the Tsar published the October Manifesto. In it, he promised basic civil liberties and the establishment of a legislative representation of the people, the Duma. For many people, this seemed like a historic breakthrough. For the first time, the autocracy seemed forced to limit its absolute power. Liberal forces welcomed the manifesto and hoped for constitutional development. Some were willing to end the protest if the empire was now gradually reformed. But it was precisely here that the internal division of the opposition movement became apparent. Liberals wanted reforms, revolutionaries wanted more. Workers and socialists distrusted the Tsar's promises. Farmers were less interested in parliamentary forms than in concrete land distribution. National minorities want their own rights. The movement had enormous power, but no unified goal and no common leadership. This made them vulnerable. After part of the moderate opposition was reassured by the October Manifesto, the government was able to take tougher action against more radical forces. Strikes were crushed, Soviets dissolved, revolutionary leaders arrested, and uprisings ended by military force. In December 1905, armed fighting was still taking place in Moscow, but it was also suppressed. The revolution failed not because it was meaningless, but because its forces did not come together permanently and because the state still had enough means of power. The army remained largely loyal, especially after the war was over and troops could be deployed inside again. The peasant uprisings were scattered, the workers' movement exhausted, and the liberal forces partially withdrew as soon as they had achieved limited reforms. Tsarism survived, but it survived battered. He had shown that he could be forced to make concessions. At the same time, he had shown that these concessions could be limited, controlled, and withdrawn at any time. After 1905, the Duma remained in existence, but it never became a truly free center of power. Nicholas II accepted it only reluctantly. Electoral laws were changed, opposition deputies were obstructed, and the government remained accountable to the Tsar, not to Parliament. This disappointed the hopes of many people. Russia now had the appearance of political reform, but not the reality of a real parliamentary order. This half measure was dangerous. It raised expectations, but did not meet them. It made political participation visible, but kept it powerless. It gave the Reich a new facade, while the old basic problems persisted. The revolution of 1905 therefore left a double legacy. On the one hand, it proved that mass protests, strikes, peasant unrest and mutinies could shake the Tsarist Empire. On the other hand, it showed the revolutionaries that spontaneous anger alone was not enough. Organization, leadership, clear goals, and the attitude of the military were decisive. The Bolsheviks and other revolutionary groups drew important lessons from this. The government also learned, but in its own way. Recognizing how dangerous political opening could be, it continued to rely on surveillance, control, and limited reforms. Thus, 1905 was not the end of a crisis, but the prelude to an even greater one. For Nicholas II, 1905 should have been a warning. It was the moment when he could have realized that Russia needed profound changes. But he saw the revolution above all as an upheaval that had been overcome with concessions and harshness. This miscalculation was disastrous. The peasant question remained unsolved, the workers' question intensified, the nationality question remained dangerous, and the political order remained contradictory. When the World War began in 1914, Russia continued to carry all these unresolved conflicts within itself. The revolution of 1905 was not the end of autocracy, but it took away its aura of imperturbability. The empire had survived, but its opponents had seen that it was vulnerable. And many people had learned that even a czar could falter if enough subjects ceased to be mere subjects. Chapter 5: The First World War as an Accelerant. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, Russia entered a conflict that was to finally break up the already tense situation of the Tsarist Empire. At first glance, the war even seemed to have a stabilizing effect at first. As in many European countries, Russia was gripped by a wave of patriotic enthusiasm. People gathered in the streets and squares, flags were waved, churches held prayers, and many believed that the empire must now stand united against external enemies. The war was seen not only as a military confrontation, but as a test of national honor, as a defense of Slavic brothers, and as a struggle for Russia's position among the great powers. But this initial enthusiasm was fragile. Only for a short time did it mask the deep social, political, and economic tensions that had been building up in the Reich for decades. The war acted like an accelerant. He did not reignite all conflicts, but he made them faster, hotter, and more destructive. Russia entered the war after the crisis in the Balkans escalated. After the assassination attempt in Sarajevo in June 1914, Austria-Hungary issued Serbia with a harsh ultimatum. Russia traditionally saw itself as the protecting power of the Slavic peoples and did not want to abandon Serbia. Behind this attitude, however, there were not only cultural or religious motives, but also power political interests. Russia wanted to secure its influence in the Balkans, keep an eye on access to the Straits and prevent Austria, Hungary and Germany from dominating the region. At the same time, the Russian leadership was convinced that a renewed retreat would damage its own great power position. Russia had already given in to pressure from other powers in previous crises. Now they wanted to show strength. But the decision to mobilize set in motion a chain that could hardly be controlled. Germany declared war on Russia, and a regional crisis turned into a European conflagration. The Russian army was huge and looked impressive on paper. Millions of men could be mobilized, and many European observers considered the sheer size of the Russian army to be a decisive strength. But mass was not the same as modern fighting power. Although the Reich had begun military reforms in the years before 1914, many weaknesses remained. The railway networks were insufficiently developed, the supply was cumbersome, the communication was poor, and the industry could not keep up with the enormous demand for weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and equipment in the long term. The army was a mirror of the empire itself, massive, brave, numerically powerful, but organizationally overwhelmed and technically insufficiently prepared for a modern industrial war. The first months of the war already showed these contradictions. Russia attacked in East Prussia to relieve pressure on France and force Germany to withdraw troops from the Western Front. Strategically, this advance actually had an effect, because Germany had to deploy forces in the east. But militarily, it ended in a catastrophe for Russia. In the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, the Russian Second Army was defeated. Shortly afterwards, another heavy defeat at the Masurian Lakes followed. The losses were enormous, and confidence in the military leadership was shaken. Although Russia achieved temporary successes against Austria-Hungary in Galicia, the war as a whole revealed early on how dearly every advance was bought. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, were wounded, or were taken prisoner. For the people at the front, the war did not mean patriotic grandeur, but mud, hunger, cold, fear, and death. The lack of equipment was particularly destructive. Many Russian soldiers were sent to the front poorly armed. At times, there was a lack of rifles, ammunition, boots, winter clothing, artillery shells, and medical supplies. The modern war devoured material to an extent that the Russian economy could hardly cope with. While Germany and other industrialized countries centralized their production and produced enormous quantities of war material, Russia struggled with transport problems, administrative chaos, and industrial bottlenecks. Even if goods were available, they often did not reach the front or the cities in time. The war thus showed that military strength depended not only on courage and mass, but also on railways, factories, administration, technology, and organization. This was exactly where the weaknesses of the Tsarist Empire lay. For the soldiers, this situation became unbearable. Most of the ordinary soldiers were farmers. They were used to deprivation, but not to being sacrificed in seemingly senseless attacks without sufficient weapons or supplies. Many hardly understood the great diplomatic goals of the war. What they understood was the suffering of their comrades, the arrogance of some officers, the poor rations, and the concern for the families at home. With each year of the war, the estrangement between the front and the government grew. In the beginning, many fought out of a sense of duty, religious loyalty, or patriotism. But the longer the war lasted, the more they wondered what they were dying for. This question was dangerous for Tsarism, because an army that loses its meaning sooner or later loses its discipline. The war also exacerbated all problems in the hinterland. Millions of men were drafted and were missing from the fields. Horses, wagons, and food were needed for the army. Agriculture came under pressure, although it was precisely this that was supposed to feed the huge empire. At the same time, prices rose. The cities suffered from supply problems, not always because there was absolutely no food in the entire empire, but because transport, distribution, and administration failed. Railways were overloaded for military purposes, trains got stuck, coal was lacking, and goods did not reach the markets. In Petrograd and Moscow, long queues formed in front of bakeries and shops. Bread became a political symbol. If a state can no longer feed its population, it loses not only practical efficiency, but also moral authority. Workers in the cities were under particular pressure. On the one hand, they were needed for war production. Factories worked for weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and equipment. On the other hand, living conditions decreased. Wages often failed to keep pace with inflation, food became more expensive, housing remained overcrowded, and work discipline was tightened in the name of the war. Strikes were quickly considered unpatriotic or subversive of the state. But hunger cannot be eliminated by patriotic slogans. The more severe the burdens became, the more often labor disputes occurred again. The memory of 1905 had not disappeared. Workers knew that joint action could have an impact. The war had initially weakened the revolutionary movement because many activists had been arrested, exiled, or mobilized. But from 1915 and 1916 onwards, the unrest returned with new force. Politically, the war dramatically exacerbated the crisis of the monarchy. Nicholas II made a momentous decision in 1915. He personally took over the supreme command of the army. From his point of view, he wanted to show responsibility and strengthen the connection between the Tsar and the army. But this decision was highly risky. As long as the military leadership was formally with generals, the Tsar could sometimes blame defeats on others. As soon as he himself was at the top, military failures were directly linked to him as a person. He also left the capital and often stayed at headquarters. This created a power vacuum in Petrograd, which was filled by Tsarina Alexandra and changing ministers. The government seemed increasingly chaotic. Ministers came and went, intrigues increased, and trust in the leadership dwindled. The public image of Tsarina Alexandra was particularly devastating. Because of her German origins, she was viewed with suspicion during the war, although personal origin alone does not prove betrayal, of course. But in a heated atmosphere, rumors became powerful. Many believed that there were German influences, betrayal, or secret sabotage at court. The influence of Rasputin further exacerbated this mood. Rasputin was controversial anyway because of his proximity to the Tsar's family. Since the sick heir to the throne Alexei suffered from hemophilia and Rasputin apparently had a calming effect on him, the Tsarina trusted him strongly. For the public, however, Rasputin became a symbol of decay, superstition, and courtly corruption. Whether individual rumors were true or not was almost of secondary political importance. Crucially, many people believed that Russia was being controlled by incompetent, alien, or dark forces. The elites also increasingly lost trust. Liberal politicians in the Duma criticized the government more and more openly. They did not want a revolution, but a more capable, responsible government that would better organize the war and regain the trust of the population. Parts of the nobility, the bureaucracy, and the military also saw that the monarchy was endangering itself. But Nicholas II remained suspicious of any real power sharing. He often saw criticism as disloyalty and held on to his autocratic self-image. In doing so, he alienated not only workers and peasants, but also those moderate forces that might have been able to stabilize the Reich. Tsarism lost its ability to form alliances. The war also changed the mood in society. Casualties, hunger, and exhaustion destroyed the initial enthusiasm. Families received messages of fallen sons, brothers, and fathers. The wounded returned to the cities and villages and told of chaos and suffering. Deserters spread their experiences. People began to compare the official slogans of perseverance with their own everyday lives. When newspapers and authorities spoke of honor and victory, while children starved and soldiers died without adequate equipment, the gap between propaganda and reality grew. This gap is dangerous for any regime. It turns disappointment into cynicism and cynicism into resistance. By 1916, Russia had not been completely defeated, but it was severely exhausted inside. The army continued to fight, and the Brusilov offensive once again brought military successes against Austria-Hungary. But even these successes cost enormous sacrifices and could not solve the general crisis. The state was overstretched. The economy suffered, the cities starved, the peasants were dissatisfied, the workers were on strike, the soldiers doubted, and the political leadership lost all credibility. Precisely because the war affected all areas of life, it connected the various conflicts with each other. The peasant question, the workers' question, the military crisis, and the crisis of confidence in the monarchy became a single explosive situation. Thus, the First World War became the decisive accelerant of the Russian Revolution. He did not create the revolution out of nothing, because the causes lay deeper and went back a long way. But he took the time for the Tsarist Empire to postpone its problems further. The war forced the system to function under the greatest possible strain, and it was precisely here that all its weakness became apparent. A state that is politically inflexible, economically overwhelmed, and socially divided can survive for a long time in peacetime. In an all-out war, however, such weaknesses become visible, measurable, and deadly. At the beginning of 1917, Russia was an empire that was still fighting, but hardly believing. The Tsar was still at the top, the army still existed, the administration was still working, and yet the internal bond between the rulers and the population was almost broken. What was missing was the moment when fear turned into open resistance. That moment came in February 1917 in Petrograd. Chapter 6, February 1917. In February 1917, the crisis of the Russian Empire reached its decisive turning point. What had been building up over decades now broke out openly within a few days. Hunger, war weariness, distrust of the government, and the exhaustion of the population combined to form a movement that at first no one fully controlled. It was not a neatly planned revolution, not a perfectly organized coup that ran according to a fixed script. Rather, the uprising arose from everyday hardship, from long queues in front of bakeries, from the anger of workers, from the insecurity of the soldiers, and from the complete loss of confidence in the Tsarist leadership. Petrograd, the capital of the empire, became the center of this explosion. There it became clear that the power of the Tsar was no longer based on consent, but almost exclusively on the hope that the army and police would obey. When this hope was also dashed, the end of Romanov's rule could no longer be stopped. Petrograd was a city under pressure at that time. The war had exacerbated the supply situation, prices had risen, fuels were lacking, and bread was becoming scarce. Although there was not an absolute shortage of grain everywhere in the empire, transport, administration, and distribution worked less and less. For the people in the capital, it did not matter whether there were still supplies somewhere in the countryside. The decisive factor was that they themselves stood in the cold for hours, and in the end perhaps still did not get any bread. This experience was humiliating and politically dangerous. Because bread was more than food. It was a sign of whether the state could still fulfill its most elementary task. When mothers could no longer feed their children, when workers stood in front of empty shops after long shifts, when soldiers' families starved, then great words about fatherland, honor, and perseverance lost their effect. The outbreak of the February Revolution began in February according to the Julian calendar used in Russia at the time, and in March according to the Western calendar. This difference in dating explains why the events often appear in Western accounts as the March Revolution, but historically became known as the February Revolution. The decisive beginning was in protests by female workers on International Women's Day. Women from textile factories took to the streets and demanded bread, peace, and better living conditions. Their role was of great importance, because they stood at a point where private hardship and political crisis coincided directly. They were workers, mothers, wives of soldiers, sisters of the fallen, and members of an urban population that could no longer bear the war. Their protest was not only a call for food, but an expression of deep social exhaustion. Other workers quickly joined the demonstrations. Individual protests turned into larger crowds. Economic demands became political slogans. Calls against the war and against the Tsar were heard more and more frequently. Factories were on strike, streets filled up, and the movement spread to various parts of the city. The authorities initially underestimated the dynamics. In the past, the state had often reacted to unrest with police, Cossacks, and the military. This time, too, it was hoped to bring the situation under control by force or intimidation. But the mood was different than before. People were no longer just afraid. Many had the feeling that they had nothing left to lose. Hunger, grief and anger made her more determined. Nicholas II was not in Petrograd, but in the military headquarters. This distance from the capital was politically disastrous. At first, the Tsar did not perceive the situation in its full severity. For him, the riots seemed like another disturbance, like a riot that had to be suppressed. He ordered order to be restored. But this is precisely where the blindness of the system became apparent. The government still believed that it was dealing with a limited public safety problem. In fact, however, the authority of the monarchy was already so severely eroded that any order for violence increased the risk of driving the soldiers themselves against the regime. The question was no longer just whether people would demonstrate. The crucial question was whether the armed forces were still willing to shoot at them. In the beginning, there was actually violence. Demonstrators were attacked, shots were fired, people died. But the suppression no longer worked reliably. Many soldiers of the Petrograd garrison were themselves war-weary, poorly cared for, and politically restless. Many of them were reservists or men who had to expect to be sent to the front soon. They did not see foreign enemies on the streets, but workers, women, young people, and people from similar backgrounds to themselves. Some had families in the city. Others knew the hardship from their own villages. As a result, the order to shoot at demonstrators became increasingly difficult to enforce morally and emotionally. In an autocratic state, obedience is the last pillar of order. But obedience can break when soldiers realize that their own interests are closer to the protesters than to those who give the orders. The decisive moment came when parts of the garrison mutinied. Soldiers refused orders, turned against their officers, opened weapons depots, and joined the demonstrators. This changed the whole situation. A mass protest turned into a revolution. The government lost control of the capital. Police stations were attacked, prisoners freed, symbols of Tsarist power destroyed. The roads no longer belonged to the authorities. The old order did not collapse slowly in orderly negotiations, but within a short time lost its ability to assert itself in practice. It turned out that the state could still give orders, but fewer and fewer people were willing to carry them out. In this situation, new centers of power emerged. On the one hand, the Duma was formed, the parliament that the Tsar had previously repeatedly restricted. Many of its members were not revolutionaries in the radical sense. They wanted order, reforms, and a responsible government. But they realized that the monarchy could no longer control the situation. A provisional committee was formed from among them, which tried to create a political alternative and prevent the complete collapse of the state. On the other hand, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers arose. It built on the experience of 1905 and quickly became a central organ of the revolutionary movement. Delegates from workers and soldiers were represented in it. In doing so, he embodied those forces that actually exercised power on the street. This dual power structure was a fundamental problem of the new order from the beginning. The Duma representatives wanted an orderly transition, a government, the ability to act internationally, and, if possible, a continuation of state authority. The Soviet, on the other hand, stood for the immediate interests of workers and soldiers, for peace, social demands, and revolutionary control from below. Both sides needed each other at first. The liberal politicians had experience, contacts, and a claim to state leadership. The Soviet had mass support and influence over the soldiers. But this cooperation was based on tension. Even in the first days after the fall of the old system, it was clear that Russia would not simply transition into a stable democracy. The question of who really ruled remained open. Nicholas II, meanwhile, tried to return to the capital, but his train was stopped and diverted. This scene had a strong symbolic meaning. The ruler of a vast empire could no longer even freely reach his own capital. Generals, politicians, and advisors increasingly made it clear to him that his abdication was necessary to save Russia from further chaos. Crucially, even parts of the military leadership were no longer willing to adhere to him unconditionally. They feared that the continuation of his rule would destroy the army and the war effort once and for all. The Tsar, who had always regarded his power as indivisible, was suddenly politically isolated. On March 2, 1917, according to the old Russian calendar, on March 15, according to the Western calendar, Nicholas II abdicated. At first he wanted to pass the crown on to his son Alexei, but because of his illness and the uncertain situation, he decided against it. Instead, he renounced for him as well and transferred the claim to his brother Mikhail. However, the latter did not accept the crown immediately, but made its decision dependent on a later constituent assembly. In practice, this meant the end of the monarchy. After more than 3 centuries, the rule of the Romanovs was over. An empire that had relied for so long on dynastic continuity, religious legitimacy, and autocratic authority lost its top within a few days. The fall of the Tsar triggered enthusiasm, relief, and hope. Many people believed that a new era was now beginning. Political prisoners have been freed, censorship has been relaxed, meetings have been made possible, parties have become more active. After decades of oppression, everything suddenly seemed open. Workers hoped for better conditions, soldiers for more humane treatment and perhaps peace, peasants for land, national minorities for more rights, liberals for the rule of law and constitution, socialists for profound transformation. The revolution had unleashed very different expectations. This was precisely their strength, but also their danger, because not all hopes were compatible. The February Revolution was therefore both a triumph and a beginning of new conflicts. It had overthrown Tsarism, but it had not solved Russia's great problems. The war continued. The land question remained open. The supply remained difficult. The economy was exhausted. The army was in the process of disintegrating. The question of political power was unresolved. The provisional government that now emerged had to lead a country that demanded freedom but was at war, needed reforms but had little time, and was supposed to secure order even though the old means of power had been broken. The Tsar had disappeared, but the crisis remained. Precisely for this reason, February 1917 was not the end of the revolution, but its first great victory. Many contemporaries believed that the hardest step had been taken. They thought that with the overthrow of Nicholas II, Russia could finally begin the path to a fairer and freer future. But revolutions rarely end with the fall of a ruler. Often only then does the struggle over which order will take its place begin. In Russia, different ideas soon faced each other: parliamentary democracy, socialist Soviet republic, peasant land revolution, military order, national self-determination, and revolutionary party rule. February had opened the door, but no one knew where the road would lead. What began as a protest against bread shortages and war had overthrown a centuries-old system of rule. But in the shadow of this victory, the forces for the next, more radical revolution were already gathering. Chapter 7: The Provisional Government. After the fall of the Tsar in February 1917, Russia was faced with a huge question: who should lead the empire now? The old order had collapsed, but a new order did not yet exist. It was precisely in this power vacuum that the provisional government emerged. It was to rule the country temporarily until a constituent assembly could be elected, which would decide on Russia's future form of government. On paper, that sounded like a reasonable transition. Russia should not immediately sink into chaos, but gradually achieve freedom, the rule of law, and political participation. But the reality was much more complicated. The provisional government inherited not only power, but also all the unresolved crises of the Tsarist Empire: the war, the famine problems, the land question, economic exhaustion, the disintegration of the army, and the expectations of millions of people who demanded immediate change after decades of oppression. The men who formed this government were largely liberal and moderate socialist politicians. Many of them came from the Duma, the parliament that had existed under the Tsar but had never had real governmental power. They wanted to transform Russia into a modern state, with civil rights, political freedom, a constitution, and democratic institutions. In their eyes, Russia now had to show that it could not only make a revolution, but also build a functioning state. They were convinced that law and order had to be maintained so that the revolution did not descend into violence and anarchy. But this was exactly where her problem lay. They wanted change, but they feared too much change at once. They wanted to overcome the monarchy, but not destroy the entire state. They wanted to give freedom, but at the same time continue the war. In doing so, they were caught between the expectations of the street and the constraints of power at an early stage. One of the most famous politicians of that time was Alexander Kerensky. He later became the most important face of the provisional government. Kerensky was a gifted orator, a man of great political ambition and a strong sense of dramatic gestures. He knew how to inspire people and present himself as a bridge between revolution and state order. He was not one of the most radical forces, but he was also not one of the old conservative elites. This is precisely why many hoped that he could unite different camps: liberals, moderate socialists, soldiers, workers, and parts of the bourgeoisie. But Kerensky's strength as an orator could not compensate for the structural weaknesses of the government. He faced problems that could not be solved by passionate appeals. The biggest problem was the war. Many people had also supported the February Revolution because they hoped that the end of Tsarism would open the way to peace. Soldiers at the front were exhausted, workers in the cities were starving, farmers wanted their sons back and their fields to be cultivated. But the provisional government decided to continue the war. There were several reasons for this. Russia was allied with France and Great Britain, and a unilateral exit would have had foreign policy consequences. The government did not want to appear as a traitor to its allies. In addition, some politicians hoped that a successful war could stabilize the young revolution and preserve Russia as a great power. They believed that Russia must continue to fight, no longer for the Tsar, but for freedom and national defense. But for millions of ordinary people, this sounded little different from the old slogans of perseverance. They wondered why they should continue to die after the fall of the Tsar. The decision to continue the war destroyed a lot of trust. Especially at the front, the mood became more and more difficult. The soldiers no longer accepted the old discipline as before. After the revolution, soldiers' committees were formed, orders were discussed, officers lost authority, and the idea of a democratized army spread. For many soldiers, this was a liberation from humiliation and arbitrariness. It was a nightmare for the military leadership. An army can hardly function in war if orders are constantly questioned. But the problem was deeper. The soldiers not only wanted to be treated differently, they often simply did not want to fight anymore. The provisional government demanded sacrifices, but could not convincingly explain to the soldiers what these sacrifices were to be made for. The land question also became a heavy burden. The peasants expected that the revolution would finally break the power of the large landowners and redistribute the land. For them, the revolution was incomplete without land reform. But the provisional government hesitated. It wanted to leave the decision on property issues to a later constituent assembly. From a legal and political point of view, this was understandable. Such a huge redistribution should not be hasty and arbitrary. But from the farmers' point of view, the weight was unbearable. They had hoped for land for decades, and now that the old order had fallen, they were to be put off again. In many regions, farmers therefore began to act themselves. They occupied estates, burned down manor houses, took supplies or refused to pay taxes. The government wanted to maintain order, but had hardly the means to enforce this order in the countryside. Tensions also grew in the cities. The workers expect better wages, shorter working hours, and more influence in the companies. After the revolution, factory committees emerged that increasingly wanted to intervene in company decisions. For the workers, this was a step towards dignity and self-determination. For entrepreneurs and liberal politicians, it was a threat to the economic order. At the same time, the supply situation continued to deteriorate. Food remained scarce, prices rose, coal was lacking, transport routes were overloaded, and the war economy devoured enormous resources. The provisional government could promise freedom, but freedom did not fill bread baskets. The longer the material hardship lasted, the stronger the disappointment became. The so-called dual power was particularly disastrous. Alongside the provisional government existed the Petrograd Soviet of workers and soldiers. This Soviet had no classical state legitimacy, but it had enormous real power because workers and soldiers trusted it. The government could publish laws and statements, but the Soviet influenced the people who were decisive on the streets, in factories, and in barracks. This created a strange situation. The provisional government bore responsibility, but it did not have full power. The Soviet had power, but initially did not want to take responsibility alone. This dual power paralyzed decisions and created uncertainty. Every important question became a balancing act between state authority and revolutionary pressure. The Petrograd Soviet was not initially dominated by the Bolsheviks. Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries had great influence in it. These moderate socialists supported or tolerated the provisional government in part, believing that Russia must first pass through a bourgeois democratic phase before a socialist development was possible. They feared that an immediate takeover of power by workers and soldiers could isolate Russia, destroy the economy, or provoke a counter-revolution. This attitude seemed cautious and theoretically grounded, but it increasingly distanced moderate socialists from the more radical expectations of many people. The longer war, hunger, and land shortage lasted, the more the Bolsheviks could claim that only they were consistent enough to really pose the question of power. The provisional government tried to open up Russia politically. It abolished many of the restrictions of the old days, granted freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and political rights. Parties were able to work openly, newspapers were published, political prisoners returned, exiles came to the country. These freedoms were historically significant. After centuries of autocratic rule, a space of political publicity suddenly emerged. But it was precisely this freedom that also accelerated radicalization. Opinions that had previously been suppressed could now be openly disseminated. Revolutionary newspapers criticized the government daily. Workers discussed in meetings, soldiers in committees, peasants in village communities. The provisional government had created freedom, but it could not control the consequences of this freedom. In the spring and summer of 1917, the government lost more and more authority. An important reason was the so-called April crisis. Foreign Minister Pavel Milyukov assured the Allies that Russia would continue the war and fulfill its obligations. When this attitude became public knowledge, it triggered massive protests. Many people saw this as proof that the new government was continuing the old imperial war aims. Under pressure, Milyukov had to resign, and the government was reshuffled. Socialists entered the government more strongly, including Kerensky. But the fundamental contradiction remained. The government wanted to have revolutionary legitimacy without fulfilling the most radical demands of the revolution. In the summer, Kerensky tried to improve the military situation and national self-confidence by launching a new offensive at the front. This offensive turned into a disaster. Initially, there were limited successes, but the discipline of the army was already too weakened, the war fatigue too deep, the supply too poor. The attack collapsed, and the German and Austro-Hungarian counterattacks exacerbated the situation. For many soldiers, this was the final proof that the government wanted to drive them further into a senseless death. Kerensky's authority was severely damaged. The Bolsheviks were now able to demand even more effectively immediate peace, immediate distribution of land, and all power to the Soviets. The tragedy of the provisional government was that it had many correct ideals, but hardly any practical power to implement them. She wanted democracy, but she ruled in a crumbling war-torn state. It wanted the rule of law, but in the countryside farmers began to seize land on their own. She wanted to preserve the army, but the soldiers wanted peace. It wanted to stabilize the economy, but inflation, supply problems, and strikes increased. It wanted to limit the revolution, but the revolution had long since ceased to be limited. Their politicians spoke of responsibility, patience, and national duty. But millions of people did not want to wait any longer. To her, such words increasingly sounded like excuses. At the same time, the provisional government was threatened from two sides. From the left, the Bolsheviks and other radical forces attacked them as bourgeois, warmongering, and incompetent. From the right, conservative officers, entrepreneurs, and property owners feared that the government was too weak in the face of chaos, socialism, and disintegration. This double threat made their position more and more uncertain. It could not satisfy the revolutionary masses and calm the forces of order. Every attempt to make concessions to the left frightened the right. Every attempt to enforce order alienated workers and soldiers. In this way, it gradually lost the center on which its existence was based. In the end, the provisional government became a symbol of unfulfilled hope. It had opened the space for freedom, but had not brought peace. It had replaced Tsarism, but it had not eliminated the social foundations of the old misery. It had promised a constituent assembly, but people were starving, fighting, and waiting for land. In revolutionary times, it is often not the best long-term concept that decides, but the ability to credibly respond to immediate needs. The Bolsheviks understood this better than their opponents. While the provisional government administered, hesitated, and appealed, the Bolsheviks gave seemingly simple answers to burning questions. Thus, between February and October 1917, the provisional government became weaker and weaker. It was born out of the collapse of autocracy and carried by the hope of a free future. But she was standing on a ground that was constantly moving. War, hunger for land, soldiers' unrest, and political radicalization left her hardly any breath. It wanted to be a bridge between the old order and the new democracy. But under this bridge, the stream of revolution was already raging. The longer the government hesitated, the stronger those forces became who no longer wanted to compromise. The fall of the Tsar had opened the first door. The weakness of the provisional government opened the second. And behind her waited a movement determined not only to replace a government, but to completely reorganize power. Chapter 8: The Soviets Emerge. When the old order collapsed in February 1917, not only a new government emerged in Russia, but also a new form of political power from below. This power bore a name that was soon to take on world historical significance: the Soviet. The word means council, and that is exactly what the Soviets were at first. Councils of workers, soldiers, and later peasants who elected delegates, formulated demands, discussed decisions, and exercised practical authority in a situation of collapse. They were not ordinary parliaments, no parties, and no authorities in the classical sense. They arose from the movement itself, from factories, barracks, street assemblies, and revolutionary meetings. They gathered the energy of those people who had not only overthrown Tsarism, but now also wanted to have a say in what was to take its place. The idea of such councils was not entirely new. Already during the Revolution of 1905, there had been a workers' soviet in Petersburg that coordinated strikes and acted as the voice of the workers' movement. At that time, this institution had been short-lived and was smashed after the failure of the revolution. But the memory remained. Many revolutionaries had understood that a Soviet could develop a special force in a revolutionary crisis. It was more mobile than a parliament, closer to the masses than a party, and more immediate than a state authority. When strikes, demonstrations, and mutinies broke out again in 1917, workers and soldiers almost instinctively resorted to this form. The Soviet was the organizational response to a situation in which the old state power had disintegrated and the new government did not yet have a firm authority. The most important of these councils was at first the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. It originated in the capital, i.e. exactly where the revolution had overthrown the Tsar. Petrograd was not only a political center, but also a place of enormous social tension. Hundreds of thousands of workers lived here. Large garrisons were located here. Ministries, railway stations, factories, newspaper editorial offices, and revolutionary networks were located here. Whoever controlled Petrograd could exert considerable influence over the entire empire. The Petrograd Soviet gathered delegates from factories and military units. These delegates were not to appear as distant professional politicians, but as representatives of concrete groups that had sent them. As a result, The Soviet had a direct connection with the workers and soldiers, whose mood it expressed and at the same time influenced. The soldiers in particular were decisive. Without their support, the February Revolution could hardly have triumphed. When sections of the Petrograd garrison refused to shoot at demonstrators and defected to the insurgents, the old regime lost its most important support. After the victory of the revolution, these soldiers did not want to simply return to the old discipline. They had experienced that they could change history through joint action. Now they wanted protection from arbitrary punishment, rights to have a say and a political voice. The Soviet offered them exactly that. For many soldiers, it became a kind of protective power against officers they associated with the old order. This gave him a significance in the army that went far beyond debates. A famous sign of this new power was the so-called Order No. 1 of the Petrograd Soviet. It addressed the troops of the Petrograd garrison and determined, among other things, that soldiers' committees should be elected and that political orders of the Duma should only be obeyed if they did not contradict the decisions of the Soviet. In addition, weapons were to remain under the control of the soldiers' committees. From the point of view of many soldiers, this order was a protection of their revolutionary rights. From the point of view of the officers and the provisional government, it was a dangerous undermining of military discipline. This was precisely where the basic problem of the new situation became apparent. The revolution had brought freedom, but in war the state needed chains of command. The soldiers no longer wanted to be treated like dumb tools, but an army in which orders were politically examined and discussed lost fighting power. The Soviets thus embodied a new legitimacy. The provisional government could refer to the Duma, to liberal politicians, and to the idea of an orderly transition. The Soviet, on the other hand, invoked the revolution itself. In a sense, he said, we represent those who stood on the streets, went on strike in the factories, and mutinied in the barracks. This legitimacy was not defined in a legally clean way, but it was politically extremely effective. In revolutionary times, it is often less important who is responsible according to the old rules, but who people actually follow. Workers listen to their factory delegates, soldiers to their committees, demonstrators to Soviet speakers. Thus, in addition to the official government, a second power emerged that did not always govern, but could very well prevent, influence, and direct. This situation was later referred to as dual power. On the one hand, there was the provisional government with ministries, diplomatic contacts, and the claim to lead Russia as a state. On the other side were the Soviets with influence on workers, soldiers, and sections of the revolutionary public. Both sides were dependent on each other and at the same time competitors. The government needed the support of the Soviet because it was hardly able to act without the consent of the workers and soldiers. The Soviet, on the other hand, did not take full power at first because its leading majorities, especially Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, believed that Russia was not yet ready for a socialist government. They wanted to protect the revolution, but they did not want to immediately take sole responsibility for the state, the economy, and the war. In the first months after February, it was not the Bolsheviks who dominated the Petrograd Soviet, but more moderate socialist forces. The Mensheviks assumed that Russia would first have to go through a phase of democratic bourgeois development. In their view, the country was not yet economically and socially ready for socialism. The social revolutionaries, on the other hand, had great influence, especially among peasants, and relied heavily on the land question. Both groups were critical of the provisional government, but partially supported it or collaborated with it. They believed that the gains of the revolution had to be secured without immediately driving the country into a radical takeover. This attitude seemed responsible, but increasingly became a problem because it underestimated the growing impatience of the masses. In the spring of 1917, the Bolsheviks were not initially the strongest force in the Soviets. Many of its leaders were in exile, or had just returned. But they had a decisive advantage. They could present themselves as a clear opposition to the provisional government. While Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries vacillated between support, criticism, and responsibility, the Bolsheviks were able to say more and more sharply that the government was continuing the war, delaying the land question, and disappointing the workers. With the slogan "All Power to the Soviets," they picked up on a mood that was slowly spreading. This slogan did not simply mean more democracy in the general sense. It meant that the councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants were to become the basis of the new power, not a government of liberal politicians and moderate compromises. The attractiveness of the Soviets also lay in the fact that they had a more immediate effect than the distant institutions of the state. In one factory, workers could elect delegates, send them to the Soviet, and put forward their demands. In a barracks, soldiers could discuss supplies, treatment, political rights, and the war. At the local level, councils were formed to deal with very practical issues: food distribution, public safety, working conditions, transport, communication, and order. Many people experienced for the first time that politics was not just something that was done by ministers and civil servants above, but something that they could participate in themselves. This experience was exhilarating. After centuries of autocratic subordination, workers and soldiers suddenly felt themselves to be acting subjects of history. But this new freedom also had chaotic sides. The Soviets were not organized in the same way everywhere, not always efficient, and not free of conflicts. In them, parties, local interests, social groups, and personal ambitions were at odds. Sometimes they were capable of acting, sometimes slow and contradictory. Her proximity to the masses made her lively, but also susceptible to mood swings. What was decided today could be called into question tomorrow under the pressure of new events. In addition, the question arose as to how a huge country should be governed permanently by councils. Could local delegates and revolutionary assemblies organize a modern state, stabilize an economy, lead an army, and regulate diplomatic relations? For many people, this was an open question. For the Bolsheviks, it later became a question of power. The emergence of the Soviets also showed how deep the mistrust of old authorities was. Workers did not trust factory owners, soldiers distrusted officers, peasants distrusted landowners, and many citizens distrusted ministries. The councils were therefore seen not only as political bodies, but as a protective mechanism. They were intended to prevent the revolution from being betrayed or reversed. This fear was not unfounded. Many conservative forces actually hoped for a restoration of order, if necessary by force. But at the same time, the mistrust meant that every state decision seemed suspicious. If the government wanted to continue the war, many saw it as betrayal. When officers demanded discipline, soldiers suspected counter-revolution. When employers refused to control production, workers saw sabotage. Society became more and more politically polarized. In the course of 1917, Soviets spread to many cities and regions. Workers, soldiers, and peasants organized themselves in councils, committees, and local assemblies. This created a revolutionary infrastructure that would later become decisive for October. The Bolsheviks did not have to invent power out of thin air. They could try to win majorities within these already existing bodies. This is exactly what became their strategy. They worked in the Soviets, criticized the moderate leaderships, campaigned for immediate peace, land distribution, and workers' control, and presented themselves as the force that took the councils seriously not only as a means of exerting pressure, but as the basis of a new state power. The Soviets were thus both hope and danger. For millions of people, they embodied the possibility of a more direct, just, and revolutionary democracy. They gave workers and soldiers a voice they had never had in old Russia. They made it clear that power could arise not only in palaces and ministries, but also in factory halls, barracks, and assembly halls. But they also contributed to the weakening of the provisional government because they formed a second authority and constantly questioned state decisions. In a peacetime, such a political opening could perhaps have been slowly ordered. In Russia in 1917, however, everything happened under the pressure of war, hunger, inflation, and social disintegration. In the end, the Soviets changed the logic of the revolution. After February, it was no longer just a question of abolishing Tsarism. It was about who should actually lead revolutionary Russia. The provisional government spoke of the constitution, elections, and responsibility. The Soviets spoke of workers' interests, soldiers' rights, bread, peace, and revolutionary control. Both claims could coexist for a time, but not permanently. The longer the government left the burning issues unresolved, the more the councils became an alternative center of power. And the more the Bolsheviks gained influence in them, the closer came the moment when the slogan "All power to the Soviets" became no longer just a demand but a program for overthrow. The Soviets were born out of the revolution. Soon they were to decide in which direction this revolution would continue. Chapter 9: Lenin returns. When Vladimir Ilyich Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917, the revolution had already broken out, but its direction had not yet been decided. The Tsar had been overthrown, the provisional government was in power, the Soviets were gaining influence, the streets were politicized, and millions of people were waiting for answers. Russia was free from the old autocracy, but not free from war, hunger, land shortage, and insecurity. It was precisely into this open, nervous, and contradictory situation that Lenin entered. His return became a turning point because he interpreted the situation differently than many other socialists. While many revolutionaries believed that Russia must now first go through a bourgeois democratic phase, Lenin demanded a radical continuation of the revolution. For him, February was not the goal, but only the beginning. In his opinion, power could not remain with a government that continued the war and postponed social issues. It had to be transferred to the Soviets. Lenin had spent many years in exile. He lived in various European countries, wrote, organized, argued with other socialists, and developed his idea of a revolutionary party. For Lenin, politics was not a game of slow compromise. He thought in terms of power, class interests, and historical opportunities. For him, the revolution was not a spontaneous outburst of emotion, but a moment in which a determined party had to act. The Bolsheviks, his faction of Russian social democracy, were not only to accompany what the masses were doing, but to give them a direction. This idea distinguished him from many moderate socialists, who relied more on broad alliances, parliamentary development, and gradual change. Lenin believed that in a revolutionary crisis, hesitation was more dangerous than boldness. His return to Russia was itself a politically explosive event. Since Russia was at war with Germany and Lenin was in Switzerland, he had to travel through German territory. The German leadership allowed him and other emigrants to pass through in a so-called sealed train. There was a clear calculation behind this. Germany hoped to strengthen revolutionary forces in Russia in order to weaken the enemy in the east and perhaps push them out of the war. For Lenin's opponents, this was later a welcome point of attack. They portrayed him as a German agent or traitor. But Lenin seized the opportunity for his own reasons. His goal was not to serve Germany, but to advance the Russian Revolution and end the imperialist war. Nevertheless, the manner of his return remained politically incriminating and became an important element of propaganda against him. When Lenin arrived in Petrograd, he was met by supporters at the Finnish railway station. Many may have expected a speech celebrating the revolutionary victory and calling for cooperation with other socialist forces. But Lenin surprised even parts of his own party. He did not simply praise the course of events so far, but sharply attacked the new order. For him, the provisional government was not a real revolutionary power, but an organ of bourgeois interests. She promised freedom, but continued the war. She spoke of democracy, but postponed the land question. It invoked the state, but in his eyes the state remained connected to the old class relations. Lenin did not want any support for this government, not even critical support. He demanded a clear demarcation. Shortly after his return, Lenin formulated his famous April Theses. These theses were not a long theoretical work, but a political program of struggle for the immediate situation. Its core was radical and simple at the same time. No confidence in the provisional government. Instant peace. Expropriation of large landholdings. Control of production by workers. Strengthening the Soviets. Preparation of a new phase of the revolution. Particularly important was the slogan that was soon to have an enormous effect: all power to the Soviets. In doing so, Lenin attacked precisely the dual power that had characterized Russia since February. He did not want the Soviets to control or influence the provisional government. They themselves were to become the basis of state power. Many Bolsheviks were initially unsure or even reluctant to do so. Some party leaders who were already active in Petrograd had taken a more cautious line. They considered it possible to support the provisional government under certain conditions, or at least not to attack head-on immediately. They, too, saw Russia as backward and wondered whether a socialist revolution was even possible in a predominantly peasant country. Lenin strongly opposed this caution. He argued that the World War had triggered an international crisis of capitalism and that the Russian Revolution could only be the beginning of a larger European revolution. Russia must take the first step. If workers and soldiers seized power, revolutionary movements in other countries could follow. This international expectation was central to Lenin's thinking. He knew that Russia alone was economically weak and socially predominantly peasant. An isolated socialist revolution in Russia was also problematic from a Marxist point of view. But Lenin hoped for an extension of the revolution, especially to Germany, where a strong workers' movement existed. His strategy was therefore based not only on Russian conditions, but on an interpretation of the World War as a pan-European convulsion. The war had radicalized millions of people, overwhelmed states, and destroyed the credibility of old elites. Lenin saw this as a historic opportunity to shake up the order not only in Russia, but far beyond. The April Theses therefore seemed like a political blow. They gave the Bolsheviks a clear line, while other parties vacillated between responsibility and opposition. Their strength lay not in the fact that they solved all problems in detail, but that they bundled the central longings of the people in a few demands. Peace appealed to the soldiers and their families. Land appealed to the peasants. Brought appealed to the workers and urban population. Power to the Soviets appealed to those who, after the fall of the Tsar, did not want the revolution to be slowed down by moderate politicians. Lenin understood that revolutionary politics in this situation began not with complicated administrative plans, but with the ability to translate the most urgent needs into an intelligible political direction. Lenin was not a mere populist who happened to find successful slogans. His demands were linked to a strict analysis of power. He saw that the provisional government was shackled by the war. As long as it respected the alliances with France and Great Britain and continued the war, it could not give peace to the soldiers. As long as it postponed the decision on the land question, it lost the peasants. As long as it protected the economic order, it disappointed the workers. As long as it did not allow the Soviets to come to full power, it remained an obstacle in the eyes of the radical masses. Lenin realized that the government could fail because of its own contradictions if the Bolsheviks pointed to these contradictions consistently enough. The provisional government and the moderate socialists initially underestimated the explosive power of Lenin's line. Many considered it extreme, unrealistic, or dangerous. They believed that his demands could plunge Russia into chaos. And indeed, his proposals were highly risky. An immediate peace would have serious territorial and political consequences. A radical redistribution of land could trigger violence in the countryside. Workers' control in factories could exacerbate the economic crisis. The seizure of power by the Soviets could provoke a civil war. But for many people who were already experiencing hunger, war, and arbitrariness, such warnings had an increasingly weaker effect. Those who lived in chaos anyway were difficult to calm down with the fear of chaos. Lenin's appearance also changed the Bolsheviks themselves. The party began to focus its agitation more systematically on the demands of peace, land, and bread. In factories, barracks, and neighborhoods, speeches were held, newspapers were distributed, and meetings were organized. The Bolsheviks presented themselves as the only force that was not responsible for the mistakes of the provisional government. While Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries lost credibility through their collaboration with the government, the Bolsheviks could present any crisis as confirmation of their warnings. When the supply got worse, they said, the government cannot give you bread. If the front continued to claim victims, they said, the The government wants to continue the war. When farmers had to wait for land, they said, the government protects the owners. Especially in Petrograd and other industrial centers, their influence grew as a result. Workers who were dissatisfied with the results of the February Revolution listened more closely. Soldiers who no longer wanted to go to the front found in the Bolsheviks a voice for their war weariness. The party also gained in importance among sailors, for example in Kronstadt. Kronstadt became a center of radical revolutionary sentiment. There, military indiscipline, political self-confidence, and deep hostility to old authorities were combined. For Lenin, such places were important because they showed that revolutionary energy was far from exhausted. Nevertheless, the path to power was by no means certain. In the spring of 1917, the Bolsheviks were still a minority in many Soviets. Their opponents had strong organizations, broader roots, and in some cases more trust. Lenin not only had to convince the masses, but also to bring his own party on a more offensive line. He did this with great determination. His political language was sharp, uncompromising, and focused on decision. He hated unclear formulas that were supposed to calm down different camps. It was precisely this toughness that made him dangerous for opponents and convincing for supporters. At a time when many politicians were weighing, Lenin declared where the revolution had to go. An important part of his strategy was to combine patience and radicalism. Although he called for the Soviets to take power, he knew that the Bolsheviks first had to win majorities. An isolated action could have failed. Therefore, his line was aimed at political enlightenment and organizational preparation. The party was to work in the Soviets, agitate in factories, recruit soldiers, and let the provisional government be exposed by its own mistakes. Lenin understood that revolutionary situations change rapidly. What seemed impossible in April could become realistic in July or October if war, hunger, and political crises escalated further. His return thus brought a new clarity to the revolutionary landscape. Before Lenin, the February Revolution had been understood by many as a joint victory against Tsarism. After Lenin, it became clearer that this victory was only the first stage of a deeper power struggle. The question was no longer just monarchy or freedom. It was, what freedom, for whom and under whose rule? Should Russia become a parliamentary democracy, led by liberal and moderate socialist forces? Should it continue the war until an acceptable peace solution was reached? Should the land question be settled by laws and a subsequent assembly? Or should workers, soldiers, and peasants take power into their own hands immediately? Lenin gave answers to these questions that were frightening for many and liberating for others. He did not promise a smooth transition. He spoke of class struggle, a break with the old order and revolutionary power. But his words hit a society that was already deeply shaken. In normal times, it might have been easier to isolate him. In Russia in 1917, however, his demands did not sound extreme to more and more people, but logical. If the war continued, it had to be ended. If the government hesitated, it had to be replaced. If the peasants wanted land, it had to be given to them. If the Soviets embodied the revolution, they should rule. Thus, Lenin's return became a decisive moment on the road to the October Revolution. He not only brought the revolution back to Russia, because it had long since broken out, but he gave it a new direction, sharper language, and a clear goal. He turned discontent into strategy, slogans into claims to power, and the weakness of the provisional government into an opportunity for the Bolsheviks. Her victory was not yet certain. They still had to experience setbacks, overcome opponents, and win majorities. But since April 1917, a force had been at the center of the political stage that was no longer willing to slow down the revolution. Lenin had returned, and with him the idea that Russia had not only overthrown the Tsar, but could recreate the entire order of power. Chapter 10: The Summer of Radicalization. The summer of 1917 became a time for Russia when the revolution lost its calm breath. What had seemed like a great joint departure in February was now increasingly turning into a struggle between opposing forces. The joy over the end of Tsarism had not disappeared, but it was overshadowed by impatience, fear, mistrust, and anger. The provisional government promised freedom, but the war continued. She promised a later decision on the land question, but the farmers did not want to wait any longer. She spoke of order, but in the cities bread, coal and work became more and more insecure. It invoked responsibility, but many soldiers saw it as just a new justification for old victims. This summer showed that a revolution does not stand still just because a government declares it over. Society moved on, and faster than the men at the top could control. The mood in the cities became more and more explosive. Petrograd continued to be the center of political unrest. Here the problems of the whole empire were condensed. Discontent grew in the factories because after the fall of the Tsar, the workers expected not only fine words, but concrete improvements. They wanted higher wages, shorter working hours, protection against redundancies, and stronger control over the companies. Many entrepreneurs, on the other hand, saw the workers' demands as a threat to production and property. They complained about declining discipline, rising costs, and political interference. A daily power struggle arose between factory management and workers' committees that went far beyond economic questions. Who decided on the company? Who really owned the factory? Did the production serve profit, the state, the front, or the people who worked there? Such questions were suddenly no longer asked only in books or meetings, but in the middle of everyday life. At the same time, the supply deteriorated. People continued to stand in long queues in front of the shops, prices rose, and inflation ate up wages. The war devoured transport capacities, raw materials, and food. In such a situation, every rumor became political. When bread was missing, people asked not only about bad organization, but about betrayal, sabotage, or deliberate restraint. Trust was so badly damaged that hardly anyone believed the official explanations. This was devastating for the provisional government. It could certainly point to real difficulties, war, traffic chaos, and economic exhaustion. But a population that is starving rarely patiently listens to administrative reasons. It asks who bears responsibility. And more often, the answer was, the government. At the front, the situation was no less dangerous. The army still existed, but its internal order disintegrated. Soldiers' committees discussed orders, officers lost authority, desertions increased, and the willingness to launch new attacks decreased. Many soldiers no longer wanted to fight for goals that seemed distant and incomprehensible to them. They had seen the Tsar fall and now wondered why they should continue to die in trenches. The provisional government tried to reinterpret the war as a defense of the revolution. It was no longer for the Tsar, but for free Russia that was to be fought. But this new language did not reach many soldiers. For them, the war had remained the same, deadly, senseless, and without a visible end. Nevertheless, Alexander Kerensky relied on a military offensive. He hoped that a successful attack could raise morale, reassure allies, and give the government new authority. This hope was understandable, but dangerous. For it presupposed that an exhausted army could be made capable of fighting again through speeches and revolutionary patriotism. In June 1917, the offensive against the Central Powers began. Initially, there were limited successes, but soon the attack collapsed. The discipline was too weak, the losses too high, the exhaustion too great. Many units refused to advance further or disbanded. The counterattacks of the German and Austro-Hungarian troops exacerbated the catastrophe. What was intended as a sign of new strength became proof of weakness. This failed offensive had enormous political consequences. It destroyed the belief that the provisional government could wage the war meaningfully. It confirmed the warnings of the Bolsheviks, who rejected the war as an imperialist war and demanded immediate peace. For many soldiers, it became clear that the new government wanted to keep them at the front just as much as the old one. For workers and peasants, the continuation of the war meant that hunger, mobilization, and deprivation continued. The slogans of the Bolsheviks thus gained strength. Peace, land, and bread were not just slogans. They sounded like direct answers to daily suffering. In July, tension in Petrograd erupted into open unrest. Armed workers, soldiers and sailors took to the streets demanding that the Soviets take power. Radical units and sailors from Kronstadt played a particularly important role. The movement was powerful, but unclear. It was an expression of genuine anger, but it was not fully coordinated. The Bolsheviks were faced with a difficult decision. On the one hand, they themselves had spread the slogan "All power to the Soviets" and sharply attacked the provisional government. On the other hand, in July, the party was not yet sure whether the time had come for a successful takeover. Lenin and other leaders feared that a premature insurrection could remain isolated and be crushed. Thus, the Bolsheviks tried to influence the movement without having completely triggered it or being able to control it with certainty. The July days were initially a setback for the Bolsheviks. The provisional government crushed the unrest and seized the opportunity to take action against the party. Bolshevik newspapers were closed, party offices were searched, leading activists arrested. Lenin had to go into hiding and fled temporarily to Finland. The accusation was renewed against him that he was working in the interests of Germany because he had returned to Russia with German help and demanded immediate peace. These accusations were politically effective because they easily caught on in a time of national fear and military crisis. For a moment it seemed as if the rise of the Bolsheviks had stopped. But this impression was deceptive. The suppression of the July days did not solve the basic problems. It did not eliminate war, hunger, or the land question, or the crisis of the army. On the contrary, it deepened the distrust of many workers and soldiers towards the government. The Bolsheviks were later able to present themselves as persecuted opponents of a system that was supposedly democratic, but which acted with repression against revolutionary forces. In addition, the provisional government remained dependent on an unstable mix of moderate socialists, liberal forces, and military authorities. It had temporarily calmed the street, but had not created a new basis of power. After the July days, Kerensky became prime minister. For many, he seemed to be the only politician who could still mediate between revolution and order. But his situation was almost impossible. From the left, he was accused of betraying the revolution and continuing the war. From the right, he was accused of being too weak against chaos, Bolsheviks, and social disorder. Kerensky wanted to save democracy, but he had to rely on an army whose discipline was disintegrating and on political forces that distrusted each other. His government increasingly seemed like a provisional arrangement in the worst sense of the word, not as a transition to a stable future, but as a transition to even greater uncertainty. Meanwhile, rural unrest grew in the countryside. Many farmers no longer wait for legal decisions. They took land, confiscated goods, evicted administrators, or destroyed property documents. For them, the revolution was a practical matter. The question was not which party was right in Petrograd, but whether the country would finally belong to those who worked it. The provisional government could hardly stop this movement. When it took action against farmers, it lost support. If she didn't do anything, she lost control. Here, too, the Bolsheviks benefited indirectly, although the social revolutionaries were traditionally more firmly anchored among peasants. The Bolsheviks were prepared to politically confirm the peasant seizure of land, while other forces continued to refer to orderly procedures and later decisions. In late summer, the next serious crisis occurred, the Kornilov affair. General Lavr Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the army, wanted to restore order, strengthen discipline, and contain revolutionary unrest. Many conservative forces saw him as a man who could save Russia from anarchy and Bolshevism. Kerensky himself had made Kornilov commander-in-chief, but a dangerous mistrust soon arose between the two. When Kornilov moved troops towards Petrograd, Kerensky feared a military coup. Whether Kornilov actually wanted to establish a classical dictatorship or whether misunderstandings, power games, and political panic interacted is historically disputed. The decisive factor was the effect. Many workers and soldiers believed that the revolution was threatened from the right. In this crisis, the Bolsheviks, of all people, were needed again. To defend Petrograd, workers were armed, Red Guards were organized, and revolutionary forces were mobilized. Railroad workers, agitators, and soldiers prevented Kornilov's troops from reaching the capital effectively. The Kornilov movement collapsed, and Kerensky survived the immediate danger. But politically, the damage was enormous. The right was weakened because it was associated with Kornilov. Kerensky seemed helpless and contradictory. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, were able to present themselves as resolute defenders of the revolution. They had been persecuted after the July days, and now they were once again at the center of the revolutionary mobilization. This development changed the balance of power in the Soviets. More and more workers and soldiers lost confidence in Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries who had supported the provisional government. The Bolsheviks won majorities in important councils, especially in Petrograd and Moscow. Their slogan, "All power to the Soviets," now took on a new meaning. As long as the Bolsheviks had been a minority, it sounded like a demand for revolutionary democracy. When they won majorities, it became the direct path to their own seizure of power. Lenin realized from the underground that the situation had changed fundamentally. The crisis of the government, the radicalization of the masses, and the growing strength of the Bolsheviks created an opportunity that would not remain open indefinitely. The summer of 1917 was therefore the phase in which the revolution lost its center. The moderate forces, which had still carried hope in February, were crushed between the extremes. The provisional government could not provide peace, land, bread. The army continued to disintegrate. The farmers acted on their own authority. The workers became radicalized. The soldiers mistrusted their officers. The right sought order through a strong hand. The left party spoke more and more openly of taking power. Each crisis made compromise more difficult and violence more likely. By the end of that summer, Russia was closer to civil war than to stable democracy. The revolution had developed a dynamic that could no longer be controlled by promises. In February, many people believed that the overthrow of the Tsar would open the way to freedom and renewal. In the summer, it became clear that freedom without peace, bread, and land remained incomplete for many. The Bolsheviks had recognized this gap and used it politically. They had become strong not because all Russians were convinced Marxists, but because they gave the clearest answers in a time of growing despair. The summer of radicalization brought them from the defensive back to the offensive. The next question was no longer whether the provisional government was weakened. The question was who would have the courage and organization to overthrow it once and for all. Chapter 11: The October Revolution. In the autumn of 1917, Russia was a country that was still outwardly led by the provisional government, but internally had long been heading for a new rupture. The hopes of February had not disappeared, but they had turned into impatience, suspicion, and open hostility. The government continued to talk about democracy, the constitution, and responsibility, but for millions of people, other questions counted. When will the war end? When will the country come? When is there bread? When will the chaos stop? In the months before, the Bolsheviks had focused on precisely these questions and had gained more and more influence. After the Kornilov affair, for many workers and soldiers, they were no longer just radical critics, but defenders of the revolution against a possible counter-revolution from the right. In Petrograd and Moscow, they won majorities in important Soviets. Thus, the slogan "All power to the Soviets" became more than a slogan. It became the immediate political program. Lenin, who had lived underground after the July days, now pushed with all his might for the insurrection. For him, the moment had come. The provisional government was isolated, the army exhausted, the population tired of war, and the Bolsheviks had growing support in the decisive centers. Lenin feared that hesitation might destroy the opportunity. He thought in historical moments. Revolutionary situations, he believed, do not open up permanently. If you don't use it, you lose it. In letters to the party leadership, he demanded that the question of power not be postponed any further. His language was sharp and impatient. He was convinced that the party had to act before the provisional government could restabilize, suppress the Bolsheviks, or the planned Constituent Assembly could change the situation politically. But even within the Bolsheviks, the uprising was not without controversy. Some leading members warned against taking too early a step. They feared that the party could remain isolated, overestimate the support in the country, or trigger a civil war that it would not win. Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev in particular expressed concerns. They considered it dangerous to seize power through an armed insurrection before a broader socialist majority was secured. These doubts show that the October Revolution was by no means an automatic process. It was the result of concrete decisions, intra-party conflicts, and a risky assessment of the situation. Lenin eventually prevailed, supported by other determined Bolsheviks, most notably Leon Trotsky, who played a key role in Petrograd. Trotsky was chairman of the Petrograd Soviet at the time and one of the main organizers of the coming seizure of power. He possessed rhetorical power, strategic flair, and great influence on revolutionary workers and soldiers. It was with his participation that the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet was formed. Officially, this committee was supposed to protect the capital against possible counter-revolutionary threats. In fact, it became an instrument of the Bolshevik seizure of power. This was precisely a decisive political advantage. The planned uprising did not appear simply as a party coup, but could be presented as a defense of the revolution in the name of the Soviet. The Bolsheviks thus linked their party strategy to the legitimacy of the councils. The provisional government under Kerensky recognized the danger, but it was too weak to avert it effectively. Kerensky tried to crack down on Bolshevik structures, close newspapers, and mobilize reliable troops. But reliable troops were hard to find in Petrograd. Many soldiers distrusted the government, did not want to be sent to the front, or sympathized with the Soviets. The garrison of the capital was politicized and unpredictable. Workers' guards, the so-called Red Guards, were armed. Sailors from Kronstadt were close to the Bolsheviks. In such a situation, the government could give orders, but their practical implementation was questionable. As in February, it became clear that power depends not only on who formally governs, but on who actually moves the armed people. The course of the October Revolution was less dramatic than later legends often portrayed. In Soviet memory, it was later staged as a huge popular uprising, as a heroic storm of the masses against the old order. In fact, in Petrograd it was more a matter of a well-organized, targeted occupation of central points. In the night of October 24th to 25th, according to the old Russian calendar, i.e. from November 6th to 7th according to the Western calendar, Bolshevik-led forces took over bridges, railway stations, telegraph offices, post offices, important administrative buildings, and communication centers. The city was not conquered in a single chaotic battle, but through the gradual control of its crucial nerve points. Whoever controlled communications, traffic, and key military posts effectively controlled the capital. The Winter Palace, where the provisional government met, became a symbol of the coup. Kerensky had left Petrograd to seek support, while his ministers remained in the palace. The defense was weak, consisting of cadets, some Cossacks, and the famous Women's Battalion, whose actual role was later often exaggerated or distorted. The attack on the Winter Palace was not a huge slaughter. There was confusion, delays, individual shots, and finally the intrusion of the insurgents. The ministers were arrested. This overthrew the provisional government in Petrograd. But the symbolic significance was enormous. The place, which had once been associated with the power of the Tsars and was now the seat of the provisional state power, fell into the hands of the revolutionaries. At the same time, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was in session. For the Bolsheviks, this Congress was decisive because they wanted to combine their seizure of power with Soviet legitimacy. When it became known that the provisional government had been overthrown, many Mensheviks and right-wing socialist revolutionaries left the Congress in protest. They accused the Bolsheviks of splitting the revolution and carrying out a coup. However, this exodus weakened her own position above all. The Bolsheviks and their allies, including left-wing SRs, stayed behind and were able to confirm the new power. Thus the Council of People's Commissars came into being as a new government, headed by Lenin. The designation deliberately sounded different from the old ministerial titles. It was intended to show that this was not simply a new government in the old style, but a revolutionary order. The first decrees of the new power were politically cleverly chosen. The decree on peace called for an immediate ceasefire and a peace without annexations and contributions. In doing so, it addressed itself directly to soldiers, workers, and war-weary people in its own country, but also to the peoples of Europe. The decree on the land essentially confirmed the peasant land grab and abolished large landholdings without compensation. Interestingly, the Bolsheviks thus adopted demands that were strongly reminiscent of the program of the social revolutionaries, because they traditionally had great influence among the peasants. Lenin acted pragmatically here. He knew that the Bolsheviks had to win or at least neutralize the peasants. Ideological purity was less important than securing power. Nevertheless, the October Revolution was controversial from the beginning. For Bolshevik supporters, it was the necessary second step of the revolution. February overthrew the Tsar, but left power in the hands of bourgeois forces willing to compromise. It was only October that gave the workers, soldiers, and peasants a government that took their demands seriously. For opponents, however, October was not a popular uprising, but an armed coup d'état by a well-organized minority. Both views contain parts of the truth. The Bolsheviks were not the only or the strongest force in the whole country, but in the decisive centers of power, they had sufficient support, organization, and determination. They took advantage of a real crisis, real mass discontent, and the weakness of their opponents. Their victory was not only based on conspiracy, but also not on a unanimous decision of the entire people. Moreover, the seizure of power in Petrograd did not automatically mean control over the whole of Russia. In Moscow, there was much tougher fighting, and in many regions it was unclear who actually had the authority. The empire was huge, the administration was shattered, the army was in dissolution, and different parties, national movements, local councils, peasant committees, and military forces pursued their own goals. The Bolsheviks had taken over the central government, but they had to impose their rule first. October was therefore not the end of the revolution, but the beginning of a new, even more brutal phase. The question was no longer just whether the Bolsheviks could seize power, but whether they would retain it. Kerensky still tried to reverse the revolution. Together with loyal troops, including units under General Krasnov, he advanced against Petrograd. But the attempt failed. Support remained limited, the revolutionary forces defended the capital, and Kerensky finally lost his political role. His fall made it clear how much the provisional government had lost its foundation. It had fallen not only through Bolshevik determination, but also through its own inability to solve war, land, and social hardship. A government that has neither the masses, nor the army, nor the elites firmly behind it at decisive moments can hardly hold on. With the October Revolution, the language of power changed. Terms such as People's Commissars, Soviet power, workers' control, and revolutionary peace took the place of the old state formulas. But behind the new words were immediately hard decisions. How was peace to be achieved if Germany imposed harsh conditions? How was the economy supposed to function when factories collapsed and workers demanded control? What should political freedom look like if opponents did not recognize Bolshevik rule? How should a party that governed in the name of the councils deal with Soviets in which it did not have a majority? These questions would soon show that the revolution meant not only liberation, but also coercion, violence, and concentration of power. October 1917 later became a founding myth of the Soviet Union. In films, posters, textbooks, and celebrations, it appeared as a clear, heroic moment in which the masses consciously took history into their own hands. Historically, it was more complicated. It was at the same time an expression of genuine social despair, the result of Bolshevik organization, the consequence of the weakness of the provisional government, and the beginning of a new form of political rule. It was neither just a spontaneous popular uprising, nor just a secret coup. It was a change of power in a revolutionary crisis in which legitimacy, violence, hope, and calculation intertwined. In the end, Russia was at a point from which there was no easy way back. The Tsar had been overthrown for months, the provisional government had fallen, and the Bolsheviks declared that they would govern in the name of the workers, soldiers, and peasants. Many people welcomed this because they finally expected peace, land, and bread. Others feared the beginning of a dictatorship and the collapse of any legal order. Both expectations were to gain importance in their own way. The October Revolution brought power to the Bolsheviks, but it did not immediately bring peace and stability to Russia. Instead, it opened the door to negotiations with Germany, civil war, terror, expropriation, and the construction of a completely new state. The assault on power had succeeded. But now the much more difficult struggle began over what this power would do to Russia. Chapter 12. Peace with Germany. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks faced one of their most difficult decisions. They had seized power with a promise to end the war. Peace had not only been a political agenda, but one of the strongest hopes that millions of soldiers, workers, and peasants had for the new government. Since 1914, World War I had exhausted Russia, killing or wounding millions of people, destroying supplies, tearing families apart, and undermining trust in any state leadership. The soldiers wanted to go home, the farmers wanted to cultivate their fields, the workers wanted bread and an end to the deprivations. Lenin and the Bolsheviks knew that they could not disappoint this expectation. If they continued the war, they would repeat the very mistake that broke the provisional government. But it was easier to promise peace than to actually achieve it. The situation at the front was catastrophic. After years of war and months of revolutionary unrest, the Russian army was hardly a cohesive armed force. Discipline and chains of command were weakened. Many soldiers deserted or were just waiting for the opportunity to go home. Entire units lost their combat power. The old officer structures were shaken, soldiers' committees had gained influence, and the idea of continuing to die in an old war for a new revolutionary government convinced only a few. The war could no longer be saved for most ordinary soldiers. Even if the Bolsheviks had wanted to, they would hardly have had the means to lead a large, reliable offensive or to stabilize the front permanently. Lenin saw this more clearly than many of his opponents. For him, the young Soviet power only had a chance of survival if it gained time. The state was shaken, the administration disintegrated, the economy was in ruins, and resistance to the new Bolshevik rule arose all over the country. In such a situation, a continued war against Germany was life-threatening. Lenin was willing to accept a hard peace, even if it meant territorial losses and political humiliation. For him, the decisive question was not whether Russia emerged from the war honorably, but whether the revolution survived. If Soviet power were overthrown, all other goals would be lost. So peace was not a sign of weakness for him, but a tactical necessity. But within the Bolshevik leadership, this question was highly controversial. Many revolutionaries felt that a special peace with Germany was a betrayal of the international workers' movement. They hoped that the revolution would soon spread to Europe, especially Germany. The war had also created hunger, exhaustion, and social tensions there. So why make concessions to an imperial opponent when German workers and soldiers themselves might soon rise up against their government? Some Bolsheviks, the so-called left communists, preferred to wage a revolutionary war. They believed that Russia had to continue the struggle against German imperialism in the name of world revolution, even if the military situation was bad. For them, a humiliating peace was a moral and political catastrophe. Leon Trotsky, who led the negotiations with the Central Powers as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, played a special role. Trotsky tried an intermediate position. He did not want to continue the war, but he also did not want to sign peace on the harsh German terms. His formula was, neither war nor peace. Russia should end the fighting, demobilize the army, but not sign the treaty. Behind this was the hope of delaying the negotiations, strengthening the revolutionary effect on the workers of Europe and putting Germany under political pressure. Trotsky was a brilliant orator and also understood the negotiations as a stage for propaganda. He wanted to show that the Soviet government was pursuing a new kind of diplomacy, open, revolutionary, and directed against the collusion of the old powers. The negotiations took place in Brest-Litovsk, a city that was then under German control. There, representatives of the Soviet government met with delegations from Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The atmosphere alone made it clear how unevenly the forces were distributed. Germany was in a stronger position militarily. The German leadership wanted to end the war in the east in order to be able to transfer troops to the Western Front. At the same time, she wanted to take as much advantage as possible from Russia's weakness. The Central Powers demanded enormous cessions of territory and zones of influence. For Russia, it was about Finland, Poland, the Baltic regions, Ukraine, and other regions, i.e., areas of great economic, strategic, and symbolic importance. The Bolsheviks had recently proclaimed the right of peoples to self-determination. They wanted to distance themselves from the old imperial thinking of the Tsarist Empire. But now it became clear how complicated this claim was in reality. Many peripheral areas of the former Reich sought their own paths, national movements gained strength, and Germany used such developments for its own interests. Ukraine in particular became a decisive factor because it was important for grain supply, raw materials, and strategic control. A Russia without influence on Ukraine lost not only territory, but also economic foundations. The question of peace was therefore not only a question of the front, but also a question of food, industry, railways, and the future of the state. When Trotsky broke off the negotiations and declared that Russia was ending the war but would not sign peace, Germany did not react with restraint. In February 1918, the German army began to advance again. The advance met with barely organized resistance. The Russian troops were no longer able to hold the front. Cities and areas fell rapidly. This German attack destroyed the illusion that one could simply get out of the war without a treaty. The Soviet government had to realize that revolutionary rhetoric does not replace an army. Lenin used the crisis to assert his position. He argued that any further resistance would only bring worse conditions. Anyone who does not sign now endangers the existence of the revolution. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on March 3, 1918. His conditions were harsh. Russia lost huge territories, including Poland, Finland, the Baltic countries, and influence over Ukraine. Millions of people now lived outside the control of the Soviet government. Important agricultural and industrial regions were lost. For many Russians, including opponents of Tsarism, this was a national humiliation. The peace seemed like a dismemberment of the old empire. Conservatives saw this as proof that the Bolsheviks had betrayed Russia. Moderate socialists accused them of having handed the country over to an imperial opponent. Even many revolutionaries saw the treaty as a painful blow to pride, security, and the future. But Lenin defended peace with the utmost determination. For him, Brest-Litovsk was a bitter but necessary price. He compared the situation to a retreat, which is necessary in order to be able to fight again later. The revolution, according to his logic, needs a breather. A dead revolutionary state cannot support a world revolution, build a new society, and defend power. The Bolsheviks had to survive at first. This attitude showed Lenin's political realism. He was ready for radical goals, but on tactical issues he could be surprisingly sober. Where others spoke of honor, revolutionary war, or moral steadfastness, Lenin asked about power, time, and chances of survival. However, peace triggered new conflicts. The left socialist revolutionaries, who had initially collaborated with the Bolsheviks, firmly rejected the treaty. They saw it as a surrender of revolutionary principles and peasant interests, especially in Ukraine. Tensions between them and the Bolsheviks soon intensified to such an extent that cooperation broke down. This made Bolshevik rule politically narrower and less pluralistic. Peace thus indirectly contributed to the Bolsheviks relying more heavily on their own party, their security organs, and their means of power. The revolution that had begun in the name of the Soviets was moving more and more clearly in the direction of party rule. The civil war was also exacerbated by Brest-Litovsk. Opponents of the Bolsheviks used the treaty as a propaganda weapon. White generals, monarchist forces, liberals and other anti-Bolshevik groups presented themselves as defenders of Russia against betrayal and disintegration. Foreign powers also viewed the situation with suspicion. For France and Great Britain, the Russian exit from the war was a heavy blow, because Germany could now move troops to the Western Front. They also feared that war material, ports and strategic areas could come under German control. Later, Allied interventions supported various anti-Bolshevik forces. So peace did not bring real calm, but shifted violence from the international front to Russia's internal conflicts. For the population, the consequences were contradictory. Many soldiers welcomed the end of the war because they could finally go home. But the return home did not automatically mean peace in everyday life. Many found their villages in turmoil, their families in need, and their country in a new political uncertainty. Workers hoped for better supplies, but the loss of important areas and economic disruption exacerbated the crisis. Farmers were given land, but at the same time the state, civil war and requisitioning increasingly interfered with their lives. The Great War against Germany ended for Russia, but the violence did not disappear. It only changed its shape. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk also had a short lifespan. When Germany lost the First World War in November 1918, the treaty became invalid. The German defeat fundamentally changed the situation. Many of the territories that Russia had lost now became part of new national developments or remained contested. For the Bolsheviks, this subsequently confirmed Lenin's argument. A hard peace had been accepted to buy time, and after the collapse of Germany, the conditions were no longer valid in the same form. But the political and human price had already been paid. The months between March and November 1918 had changed Soviet power, mobilized its opponents, and further opened the way to civil war. Brest-Litovsk shows one of the great moral tensions of the revolution. The Bolsheviks had promised peace and actually fulfilled this promise, but only through a treaty that brought enormous losses to Russia. They acted in the name of the ordinary soldiers who no longer wanted to die, but at the same time they decided entire regions and peoples in a power game between revolution and imperial violence. They condemned the secret diplomacy of the old powers, but had to negotiate under brutal pressure themselves. They spoke of self-determination, but lost spaces of influence in which new dependencies emerged. Peace, therefore, was neither pure liberation nor mere betrayal. It was a decision under extreme conditions, made by a government that wanted to survive and had few good options. In the end, peace with Germany made it clear how difficult it is to turn revolutionary promises into state policy. As an opposition party, the Bolsheviks could demand immediate peace. As a government, they had to sign a concrete treaty, with limits, losses, enemies, and consequences. They had ended the war, but not the violence. They had given the soldiers an answer, but provided the opponents with new arguments. They had gained time, but increased political isolation and internal radicalization. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was therefore not a marginal event, but a key to understanding early Soviet rule. He showed that the revolution did not take place in a world of free possibilities, but in a world of war, coercion, hunger, and power politics. The Bolsheviks had bought peace. But the prize led Russia directly into the next abyss, civil war. Chapter 13. The Civil War begins. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk ended Russia's war against Germany, but it did not bring real peace to the country. On the contrary, no sooner had the front been silenced externally than an even tougher struggle broke out internally. Russia sank into a civil war that was not only fought between two armies, but between worldviews, social groups, regions, hopes, and fears. The October Revolution had brought the Bolsheviks to power, but it had not yet secured them control of the vast former Tsarist Empire. Many people did not accept their rule. For some they were saviors of the revolution, for others usurpers, traitors, destroyers of property, enemies of religion, or agents of chaos. This opposition gave rise to a war that devastated Russia and forced the young Soviet power into an atmosphere of siege, violence, and ruthless decisions from the very beginning. The causes of the civil war ran deep. The October Revolution had not united the political order, but further divided it. The Bolsheviks had taken power in the name of the Soviets, but by no means all socialists, workers, peasants, or soldiers were behind them. Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, liberals, monarchists, national movements, Cossack associations, conservative officers, and many regional forces pursued their own goals. Some wanted the monarchy back, others a parliamentary democracy, still others a socialist order without Bolshevik party rule. Some fought for national independence, others for the restoration of a unified Russia. As a result, the anti-Bolshevik side was diverse from the beginning, but also divided. She was later often referred to as the Whites, but this designation obscures how different their interests were. The Reds, i.e. the Bolsheviks and their allies, had a decisive advantage. They had a clear center of power, a determined party, and control over important cities in central Russia. A particularly important trigger for the further escalation was the question of the Constituent Assembly. The provisional government had promised it, and many people had seen in it the hope of a democratic reorganization. When the elections finally took place, the Bolsheviks did not receive an absolute majority. The social revolutionaries in particular performed strongly because they enjoyed great trust in the countryside. For Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this result was dangerous. They had just taken power and did not want to leave it to a congregation in which their opponents were strong. When the Constituent Assembly convened in January 1918 and did not simply confirm the Bolshevik course, it was dissolved. This step was a decisive break. For the Bolsheviks, Soviet power was to be valued more highly than a parliamentary assembly, which in their view reflected an outdated political phase. For their opponents, the dissolution was proof that the Bolsheviks did not want freedom, but party rule. This intensified the political front. The Bolsheviks saw themselves surrounded by enemies and justified harsh measures with the need to defend the revolution. Their opponents, on the other hand, saw fewer and fewer opportunities to fight them legally. When elections were not respected, opposition newspapers were closed, political opponents were persecuted, and property relations were radically changed. Many had no choice but to engage in armed resistance. The Civil War thus arose not only from military hostility, but from the collapse of common political rules. Neither side trusted the other. Each side was convinced that defeat could mean not only loss of power, but annihilation. The Whites formed in different regions. In the south of Russia, conservative officers, Cossacks, and volunteers gathered to fight against the Bolsheviks. In Siberia and in the east, other anti-Bolshevik centers were established. Fronts also formed in the north and northwest. But the White forces had a big problem. They were geographically dispersed and politically disparate. Some of its leaders dreamed of restoring a strong, undivided Russia. Others wanted above all to secure order, property, and military discipline. Many farmers distrusted them because they feared that the Whites would bring back the old landowners and reverse the land grab. This was precisely one of the decisive weaknesses of the White movement. Although it was able to mobilize against Bolshevism, it did not offer many ordinary people a convincing positive future. The Bolsheviks understood this social question better. They had abolished large landholdings and recognized the peasant land grab. Although relations between Soviet power and peasants were later to be severely strained by compulsory levies and violence, at the beginning many peasants feared the return of the old owners more than the Bolshevik government. The Bolsheviks could therefore present themselves as defenders of the land revolution. Even peasants who were not convinced communists could support the Reds at times, or at least reject the Whites. For many people, the Civil War was not about abstract ideology, but about the practical question of which side promised them land, protection, or survival. Another advantage of the Bolsheviks was their control over central Russia. They held important industrial areas, large cities such as Moscow and Petrograd, and central railway lines. That was militarily decisive. Railways were lifelines in the Russian Civil War. Those who could move troops, weapons, grain and messages had an enormous advantage. Despite great difficulties, the Reds were often able to coordinate their forces better than their opponents, who fought on the fringes of the former empire and were separated from each other. In addition, the Bolsheviks controlled large parts of the old administrative structures and were able to gradually put them at the service of their new rule. The development of the Red Army played a central role. After the revolution, the old Tsarist army had practically disintegrated. Many soldiers had deserted, officers had been discredited, discipline and command structures had been destroyed. For the Civil War, however, the Bolsheviks needed a powerful military organization. Leon Trotsky became a decisive figure as People's Commissar for War. He traveled along the fronts in an armored train, organized, gave speeches, controlled commanders, and relied on strict discipline. The Red Army combined revolutionary motivation with military professionalism. Former Tsarist officers were called in because their expertise was needed. At the same time, they were assigned political commissars to monitor their loyalty. This system showed the pragmatism of the Bolsheviks. They despised the old elite, but used their abilities when the survival of the revolution depended on them. The Civil War was fought with great severity from the beginning. Both sides committed violence against opponents, suspects, and civilians. The war was not only a struggle of regular armies, but also a war of shootings, hostage-taking, requisitioning, terror, retaliation, and political cleansing. The Bolsheviks expanded the Chayka, their political secret police, which took action against alleged counter-revolutionaries. For the leadership of the party, terror was a means of defending the revolution. She believed that leniency towards enemies would mean doom. This logic was reinforced by the Civil War. Those who feel constantly threatened tend to treat all criticism as betrayal and every opposition as a mortal danger. This gave rise to a political culture in which violence did not remain the exception, but became an instrument of rule. The whites also rely on violence. In areas controlled by them, there was repression against Bolsheviks, labor activists, Jews, peasants, and suspected sympathizers of the Reds. Anti-Semitic pogroms, in particular, became a terrible part of the Civil War, especially in Ukraine and other embattled regions. Many white commanders could not or did not want to prevent such violence. As a result, they also lost trust among parts of the population. The Civil War was therefore not simply a clear struggle of order against chaos or revolution against reaction. It was a space in which various forms of violence, hatred, and revenge were released. The international dimension further exacerbated the situation. Several foreign powers intervened directly or indirectly in the Civil War. Britain, France, Japan, the United States, and others at times supported anti-Bolshevik forces or sent troops to certain regions. Their motives were different. They wanted to prevent war material from falling into German hands, possibly reviving the Eastern Front, securing their own interests and curbing the spread of Bolshevism. For the Bolsheviks, this intervention was a propagandistic gift. They could claim that Soviet power was defending Russia not only against internal enemies, but also against imperialist interference. In doing so, they combined revolutionary defense with national self-assertion. For the population, the Civil War was a catastrophe. Cities suffered from hunger, cold, and economic collapse. Factories were at a standstill, transport routes were destroyed, money lost value, and many people left the cities to look for food in the countryside. In the countryside, on the other hand, armed units moved through the villages, demanding grain, horses, clothing, or recruits. Farmers got caught between the fronts. Anyone who gave something to the Reds could be punished by the whites. Those who supported the whites risked retaliation from the Reds. Many tried to simply survive and avoid any firm partisanship. But in a civil war, neutrality is often not respected. Each side seeks food, people, and loyalty. The beginning of the Civil War also changed the Bolsheviks themselves. Before coming to power, they had spoken of councils, workers' control, and revolutionary democracy. During the war, however, power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of the party and its leadership. Decisions had to be made quickly, opponents were excluded, independent movements were watched suspiciously. The state of emergency became the normal form of government. The Bolsheviks justified this with the existential threat. You said that without hard centralization, the revolution would be destroyed. But this centralization had long-term consequences. It had a profound impact on the emerging Soviet state and prepared an order in which political diversity had less and less space. The Civil War thus began not as a single event, but as a gradual expansion of conflicts that had been inherent since 1917. The dissolution of the old order, the dispute over the Constituent Assembly, the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, the land revolution, the fear of counter-revolution, foreign intervention, and the Bolsheviks' claim to power merged into a huge struggle. Russia became the battlefield of various visions for the future. Should the country find a parliamentary order, return to the monarchy, disintegrate into individual national states, or build a new socialist society under Bolshevik leadership? This question was not decided in calm debates, but with guns, hunger, coercion, and terror. At the beginning of this war, the outcome was by no means certain. The Bolsheviks had resolute leadership, central positions, and clear slogans, but they also had powerful enemies. The Whites had experienced officers, foreign support, and the desire of many property owners for order. But they suffered from disunity, social backwardness, and a lack of confidence on the part of the peasants. The Civil War was intended to show that military strength alone was not enough. The decisive factor was who could better combine supply, transport, political message, and social interests. The Reds understood that they had to not only fight, but also portray the enemy as a return to the old oppression. Whites often understood too late that anti-Bolshevism alone does not create a mass base. Thus, after Revolution and World War, the next abyss began. Russia had lost the Tsar, overthrown the provisional government, made peace with Germany, and yet found no peace. The Civil War became a trial by fire for the Bolsheviks and a path of suffering for the population. He decided not only who would rule Russia, but also what kind of state would emerge from the revolution. In its violence, mistrust, and merciless logic, the early Soviet power was formed. What had begun as a promise of peace, land, and bread was now accompanied by war, confiscation, and terror. The Civil War was therefore not only a consequence of the revolution. It became the furnace in which the revolution took its final form. Chapter 14: Terror, Propaganda, and New Order. When the Bolsheviks seized power, they were faced with a problem that every revolution sooner or later faces. How do you hold a new order together when large parts of the country reject it, when the economy collapses, when armed opponents attack, and when one's promises grow faster than the possibilities of fulfilling them? The Bolsheviks had promised peace, land, and bread. But after October 1917, people did not find themselves in a peaceful, prosperous, and free society, but in a country marked by civil war, hunger, coercion, and political radicalization. It was precisely in this situation that the instruments with which the new power consolidated its rule emerged: terror, propaganda, central control, political elimination of opponents, and the construction of a state that saw itself as the voice of the revolution, but tolerated less and less dissent. The terror of the early Soviet power did not arise out of nowhere. Russia had already been a country of political violence before the revolution. The Tsarist Empire had had members of the opposition monitored, banished, arrested, and executed. The World War had accustomed millions of people to violence, death, and command. The Civil War turned entire regions into spaces of revenge and retaliation. But the Bolsheviks gave the violence a new ideological justification. For them, the revolution was surrounded by enemies: white generals, monarchists, liberal opponents, foreign intervention powers, saboteurs, speculators, former proprietors, and alleged traitors at home. In such a view, political opposition was no longer understood as a legitimate dispute, but as an attack on the revolution itself. Anyone who stood against the Bolsheviks could easily be considered a counter-revolutionary. And those who were considered counter-revolutionaries had little claim to leniency. A central tool of this policy became the Chaika, the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. It was founded at the end of 1917 and quickly developed into a feared political police force. Their mission was broad, their methods harsh, and their power grew with the Civil War. The Chayka arrested suspects, interrogated opponents, confiscated property, monitored the population, and carried out shootings. In the eyes of the Bolsheviks, it was a necessary protective organ of the revolution. In the eyes of its victims, it was a symbol of a new oppression. Crucially, the Chayka not only fought specific armed enemies, but also created a climate of fear. People had to reckon with the fact that criticism, origin, possessions, former offices, or mere suspicions could become dangerous. The so-called Red Terror intensified especially in 1918, after the situation escalated into the Civil War and Lenin was seriously injured in an assassination attempt. The Bolsheviks reacted with massive severity. Hostage-taking, shootings, and public threats were intended to show that the new power would not retreat. Terror was not only a spontaneous reaction to violence by opponents. It was deliberately used as a political tool. It was intended to deter, paralyze enemies, and force the undecided to comply. The logic behind this was brutal. In a civil war, the Bolsheviks believed, only those who were more determined and tougher than their opponents could survive. Moral concerns were subordinated to the goal of saving the revolution. But it was precisely this that changed the revolution itself. A movement that promised liberation now built institutions that generated fear and obedience. At the same time, the opponents of the Bolsheviks also used violence. The White Terror, pogroms, retaliatory actions, and repression in anti-Bolshevik areas were cruel reality. The Civil War was not a struggle of a non-violent side against a violent side. But the Bolsheviks differed in that they gradually created a permanent security apparatus that was built into the nascent state. Violence remained not only a side effect of the war, but became a component of political rule. This had long-term consequences. Those who build their power in an atmosphere of constant threat become accustomed to valuing control more than trust and obedience more than free consent. In addition to terror, propaganda played an equally central role. The Bolsheviks understood very well that power is not secured with guns alone. People have to be convinced, mobilized, or at least reached emotionally. Even before the revolution, they had used newspapers, leaflets, speeches, and meetings. After the seizure of power, propaganda became a state tool. Posters, newspapers, wall newspapers, agitation trains, theater, songs, and speeches were to create a new reality. The message was clear: Soviet power defends workers and peasants against exploiters, landlords, capitalists, foreign imperialists, and white generals. The world was divided into simple opposites. Here the revolution, there its enemies. Here the future, there the past. Here the people, there the oppressors. This simplification has been effective. Many people could hardly follow complicated political programs, but they understood images and clear slogans. A white general could be depicted as the return of the old nobility. A rich merchant could appear as a speculator who would starve the people. A foreign soldier stood for imperialist interference. The simple red fighter, on the other hand, became the defender of the new world. Propaganda gave the Civil War a moral form. It explained suffering not as the result of its own failure, but as the result of enemy attacks. Hunger, coercion, and hardship did not become more pleasant as a result, but they became more politically interpretable. Those who suffered should believe that they were suffering for a greater future. Control over language was particularly important. The Bolsheviks gave new meanings to old terms. Government was now called the Council of People's Commissars. Ministers became People's Commissars. Opponents became counter-revolutionaries. Coercion could be considered a revolutionary necessity. This language was not mere decoration. It shaped how people perceived reality. When a party claims to represent the working class as a historical force, opponents of that party quickly appear to be opponents of history itself. As a result, political pluralism became increasingly difficult. Anyone who represented a different socialist line could be considered a divider. Anyone who demanded free elections could be portrayed as a tool of bourgeois interests. Anyone who criticized the violence could be accused of helping the enemies of the revolution. The new order was also evident in the economy. During the Civil War, so-called war communism emerged. It was not so much a fully thought-out economic system as a radical emergency order under wartime conditions. The state intervened massively in production, distribution, and supply. Factories were nationalized, private trade was restricted, food was confiscated, especially grain in the countryside. The cities and the Red Army had to be fed, and the Bolsheviks saw compulsory levies as a matter of survival. For the farmers, however, this meant a heavy burden. They had been given land, but now armed squads came to collect grain. Many farmers wondered what the new freedom consisted of when the state took away their harvest. The relationship between the peasantry and the Soviet government was deeply damaged as a result. The revolution also changed in the factories. Initially, many workers had hoped that they would be able to directly determine production and working conditions through factory committees. But during the Civil War, the Bolshevik leadership increasingly relied on centralization, discipline, and state leadership. Production had to work, the army needed equipment, the cities needed supplies. Spontaneous workers' control was less and less suited to the requirements of a war-torn state. This created a contradiction between revolutionary self-administration and the central command economy. The Bolsheviks increasingly opted for control from above. They justified this with necessity, but for many workers it felt like a new form of paternalism. Politically, the new order also became narrower. Other parties were increasingly obstructed, persecuted, or eliminated. The left socialist revolutionaries, who had initially cooperated with the Bolsheviks, broke with them because of Brest-Litovsk and other conflicts. Mensheviks and right-wing socialist revolutionaries lost their possibilities of action. Newspapers were closed, assemblies banned, opponents arrested. The Bolsheviks justified this with the Civil War and the danger of counter-revolution. But the result was clear: a revolution that had begun in the name of the Soviets and the masses developed into a rule in which one party increasingly determined what the revolution should mean. The Bolsheviks must not be regarded as cold power technicians. Many of her supporters actually believed in a better future. They wanted to fight illiteracy, abolish social privileges, open up education, improve women's legal status, remove old class barriers, and create a society in which birth and property no longer decide on life. In the midst of terror and civil war, there were also real experiences of new beginnings. People from poor backgrounds were given new opportunities. Young activists felt like builders of a new world. Art and culture experimented with revolutionary forms. Schools and political education were supposed to bring about a new society. It is precisely this mixture that makes time so contradictory. Hope and violence did not stand separately next to each other, but were interwoven. The propaganda of the Bolsheviks lived on this hope. It promised not only victory in the Civil War, but a completely new future. A world without exploitation, without large landowners, without capitalists, without Tsarist arbitrariness. But the more the present was shaped by coercion, the greater the gap between promise and reality became. The leadership explained this gap with war, sabotage, backwardness, and external enemies. In many ways, this was not entirely wrong. Russia was indeed destroyed, besieged, poor, and torn. But the constant appeal to enemies had a dangerous effect. It made it possible to justify almost any harshness and to suspect any criticism. Thus, a new state was formed during the Civil War. It was not simply the direct implementation of a theoretical program, but the result of ideology, hardship, fear, violence, and power struggles. The Bolsheviks learned that central control brought them advantages. They learned that propaganda could mobilize masses. They learned that terror intimidated opponents. They learned that political diversity was dangerous from their point of view. And they learned that the state of emergency could be an effective means of rule. These experiences had a profound impact on the later Soviet Union. Many structures that appeared as temporary emergency measures during the Civil War became permanent patterns. In the end, the new order of the Bolsheviks was a paradox. It was born out of a revolution against oppression, but it created new forms of oppression. It promised power to the workers and peasants, but it increasingly concentrated power in the party, state, and security apparatus. It fought against old privileges, but opened up new hierarchies. She spoke of liberation, but demanded obedience. It gave millions of people a historic vision and took away the freedom, property, or life of many others. Precisely for this reason, this phase cannot simply be explained as a betrayal or a necessary rescue. It was both the attempt to defend a revolution under extreme conditions and the moment when this revolution took on the harshness that was to determine its further fate. Terror, propaganda, and a new order were therefore not side aspects of the Russian Revolution. They were the mechanism by which the Bolsheviks rescued their power from chaos and at the same time shaped the character of the nascent state. The Civil War forced decisions, but it does not excuse everything that happened. He explains why fear and violence became so powerful, but he also shows how quickly a movement acting in the name of liberation can come to see freedom as a danger. The end result was a state that was stronger, more centralized, and more ruthless than anything many revolutionaries had hoped for in February 1917. The revolution had survived, but she had changed in her survival. Chapter 15: The Legacy of the Revolution. The Russian Revolution did not simply end with the overthrow of the Tsar, not with the Bolsheviks coming to power, nor with the victory of the Reds in the Civil War. Their real legacy extended far beyond the years 1917 and 1918. It changed Russia, Europe, and finally the whole world. From an exhausted, backward, and torn multi-ethnic empire arose a new state that saw itself as the beginning of a completely different epoch. The Soviet Union became not only a political entity, but a world historical promise, a threat, a symbol of hope, and a bogeyman at the same time. For millions of people, it meant the idea that the old order of monarchy, nobility, large landowners, and capitalist exploitation could be overcome. For others, it stood for dictatorship, terror, expropriation, political oppression, and the destruction of individual freedom. It is precisely this contradictory effect that makes the legacy of the Russian Revolution so enormous and so difficult to judge unequivocally. First of all, the revolution changed Russia itself. The Tsarist Empire, which had been ruled by the Romanov dynasty for centuries, disappeared irrevocably. The old world of court, nobility, orthodox legitimacy of rule, secret police, class order, and autocratic power was destroyed. Many members of the old elites fled, were expropriated, persecuted, or lost their social position. The Bolsheviks did not simply want to form a new government, but to create a new society. Property, power, education, work, family, religion, and culture were to be reorganized. The state was no longer to be the tool of a ruling class, but supposedly an expression of the power of workers and peasants. In reality, however, it increasingly became a centralized party state, in which the Communist Party determined what had to happen in the name of the people. The founding of the Soviet Union in 1922 was a decisive step in this development. After civil war, disintegration, and national independence movements, the Bolsheviks succeeded in reuniting large parts of the former empire under a new federal structure. Officially, this state was based on the union of equal Soviet republics. In political reality, however, the decisive power lay in Moscow and in the organs of the party. This created a new empire in revolutionary language. It differed greatly ideologically from the old Tsarist Empire, but at the same time adopted some centralist logic, a huge space, many peoples, strong control from above, and the claim to combine historical mission and state power. A direct legacy of the revolution was the profound social upheaval. The nobility lost its privileges, large landed property was abolished, the old property relations were broken up. For many farmers, this was initially the most tangible success of the revolution. They finally had access to land that they had felt was unfairly distributed over generations. But this hope was only fulfilled temporarily. Already in the following years, it became clear that the Bolshevik leadership did not want to accept peasant independence in the long term. Under Stalin, forced collectivization later occurred, forcing millions of peasants into collective farms and causing catastrophic famines and enormous violence, especially in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other regions. This was a bitter breach of one of the great promises of 1917. The farmers had expected land, but ultimately received a state that once again intervened deeply in their lives. The legacy was also contradictory for the workers. The revolution was waged in the name of the workers. Factories, production, and industry were no longer to serve the profit of individual owners, but to build a socialist society. Workers were symbolically given a central position. Her class was declared the alleged bearer of the story. But in everyday life, there was no free rule of the workers over their companies. During the Civil War and afterwards, the economy was increasingly centrally controlled. Discipline, production targets, state planning, and party control determined working life. Those who went on strike or criticized could no longer simply appear as a fighting worker, but were quickly regarded as disruptors of socialist construction. Thus, the working class became the source of legitimacy of a state in which workers themselves could only have a limited say in decision-making. Nevertheless, the revolution also brought real modernization. Soviet power invested in education, literacy, science, industrialization, and technical development. Millions of people who would have had little access to education and social advancement in old Russia were given new opportunities. Women received significantly more legal equality than in the Tsarist Empire, even if social reality and state practice often fell short of ideals. The Soviet culture of the early years experimented with art, film, literature, architecture, and new forms of coexistence. The aspiration to create a new world unleashed enormous creative energy. Precisely for this reason, the revolution was not only a political event for many contemporaries, but a feeling of new beginnings. It showed that a seemingly eternal order could fall and that history was open. But this awakening was increasingly overshadowed by repression. Even under Lenin, central elements of an authoritarian system emerged: one-party rule, secret police, restriction of the press, suppression of political opponents, and the idea that the party was in possession of historical truth. Under Stalin, this system radicalized into a comprehensive dictatorship. The revolution, which had once fought against arbitrariness and oppression, led to a state in which millions of people experienced surveillance, forced labor, deportation, show trials, fear, and violence. Of course, Stalinism was not simply identical with 1917. Between the October Revolution and the terror of the 1930s lay civil war, power struggles, economic crises, and deliberate political decisions. But many of the foundations of the later dictatorship were laid in the early phase: the elimination of political competition, the justification of violence by historical necessity, and the concentration of power in the party and security apparatus. In terms of world politics, the impact of the revolution could hardly be overestimated. For the first time, a Marxist-inspired party had permanently taken power in a large state. This fundamentally changed international politics. For socialist and communist movements worldwide, Russia became a role model, a source of support and a projection screen for their hopes. In Germany, Hungary, Italy, China, India, Latin America, and many other regions, activists looked to the Bolsheviks and wondered whether revolutionary change was possible in their countries. The founding of the Communist International was intended to unite these movements and promote world revolution. Even where no revolution broke out, fear of it was at work. Governments, employers, and conservative forces now observed workers' movements with new concern. This fear also influenced the development of Europe after the First World War. Many elites feared that social hardship, the consequences of war and political instability, could lead to Bolshevik upheavals. In some countries, this fear helped to accelerate reforms, expand workers' rights, or make socio-political concessions. In others, it strengthened authoritarian and fascist movements, which presented themselves as a bulwark against communism. Anti-communism became a powerful political force of the 20th century. Without the Russian Revolution, many of the conflicts of the interwar period, the rise of radical right-wing movements, and later the bloc formation of the Cold War would have taken a different course. The legacy of the Cold War revolution was particularly long-term. After World War II, the Soviet Union became a superpower, facing the United States as an ideological, military, and geopolitical adversary. The world was divided into blocks in which capitalism and communism represented not only economic systems, but comprehensive models of order. Nuclear weapons, proxy wars, secret services, propaganda, space travel, development policy, and ideological competition shaped decades of world history. The Russian Revolution had thus not only remained a Russian event. It had triggered a development that reached as far as Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Afghanistan, Africa, and Latin America. Everywhere the question was negotiated as to which social order should determine the future. The revolution also remains difficult to grasp morally. It arose out of real injustice. The Tsarist Empire was authoritarian, socially unequal, politically ossified, and incapable of solving the big questions of its time. Peasants suffered from land shortages, workers from exploitation, soldiers from war, national minorities from oppression. Anyone who sees the revolution only as a catastrophe overlooks why so many people wanted it, or at least supported it. It was also an uprising against an order that did not give millions a voice. But those who tell it only as a story of liberation conceal what became of it, a system that destroyed opponents, limited freedom, and justified violence as a tool of historical mission. The Russian Revolution was both a response to oppression and the origin of new oppression. It is precisely this tension that makes it one of the most important events of modernity. It shows that revolutions are not only created by ideas, but by hunger, war, humiliation, bad government, and lost trust. But it also shows that the overthrow of an old order does not guarantee a just new order. Power does not disappear when a ruler falls. It will be redistributed, and those who take it are immediately faced with decisions that can change ideals. The Bolsheviks promised to turn history in the name of the oppressed. But in the struggle for the survival of their rule, they built structures that demanded obedience and punished dissent. In this way, revolutionary hope became a state that saw itself as the future, but left many people living in fear. The legacy of the Russian Revolution continues to this day, because its questions have not disappeared. How much inequality can a society tolerate before it breaks up? When does refusal to reform become more dangerous than reform? Can violence create a just order, or does it destroy the goals for which it is used? How do you prevent a movement in the name of the people from incapacitating the people? And why do people in times of crisis often trust those forces that provide simple answers to unbearable problems? The Russian Revolution forces us to take these questions seriously because it shows what happens when a state no longer reaches its people and when political differences are no longer held by trust, institutions, and compromises. In the end, what remains is the image of a huge empire that collapsed under the weight of war, hunger, inequality, and political blindness. This collapse gave rise to a revolution that gave hope to millions and brought suffering to millions. It overthrew a Tsarism that was incapable of renewing itself and created a state that imposed new constraints in the name of renewal. It ended an old era and opened a new one, the consequences of which shaped the entire 20th century. The Russian Revolution was therefore not just an event from history books. It is a warning, a challenge, and a mirror. It shows how powerful the desire for justice can be, but also how dangerous it becomes when a political movement believes that it is in possession of the only truth.